This week's episode is sponsored by Change. Change is the #1 mentoring program that teaches you e-commerce from scratch. Change has a real community with real results. I have been working with Ryan for many years now and have attended many of his events and retreats across the world and got to meet members and the amazing community of like-minded people. Ryan works with a lot of big names in the business world, helping them build online businesses and e-commerce. Change offers personal one-on-one support, no experience needed, but like anything, this takes time and is not a get-rich-quick scheme. If you put the work in, you will get the results. E-commerce and online shopping is getting bigger and bigger. This is a great opportunity for anyone that is looking for financial freedom. For more information, go follow Ryan on Instagram at RyanJB, and he will guide you through the steps to help you get started and build a successful online business. You can now follow me on all my social media platforms to find out who my latest guest will be. And don't forget to click the subscribe button and the notifications bell so you're notified for when my next podcast goes live. Boom, we're on. And today's guest, we've got Jon Atack. Jon, how are we?
I'm great, thanks. How are you, James?
Really good, thank you. First and foremost, thanks for coming on the show. Yep. Had a nice conversation just before the cameras went on. This is what I'm all about, life and trying to figure it out with all these different theories and techniques. You kind of escaped Scientology. You were in it for nearly 10 years. Very popular. Some of the massive celebrities, John Travolta, Tom Cruise, are involved with it. But yeah, a lot of darkness around it as well. They say it's the Church of Scientology, is that correct?
It calls itself Church Scientology, yeah.
But it's not religious?
Well, it's interesting because the word church means a Christian community, ecclesias church, that's what it means. Hubbard adopted the word to make it sound like he was doing something good. But there's a letter that he wrote in on 10th of April 1953 where he asks his deputy, what do you think of the religion angle? And he talks about how much money you can make by being a religion. So I think, it may not have been entirely genuine.
Before we get into everything, though, I always like to go back to the start of my guests, get more of a bit of understanding about you, Jon, where you grew up and how it all began.
Right, well, I was born in Lichfield in Staffordshire, which is pretty much the heart of England. I had a loving family. Had three older brothers, was all pretty good until I got to be 5, and then I went to school. Really didn't like that experience. It didn't suit my temperament at all to be bullied by people who were 3 times my size and could hit me. At 14, I walked out of the prestigious grammar school I was in and told the headmaster he was going to have to apologise before I went back, and went from there to this huge comprehensive school, which was brilliant. It was run by people who actually cared, though it was a pretty raucous experience. I dropped out of there when I was 17. Got involved with Zen Buddhism, went and learned Zen meditation at Throssell Priory up in Northumberland. Meant to be there 6 months. I lasted 3 days because I had such an incredible experience. It was so overwhelming, and I think I did the right thing getting away from it to digest the experience. I played drums for a living. From the age of 15, I was playing gigs, and got stranded in Toulouse with this band where this guitar player didn't actually have any gigs. When I got back, I was 19, this is 74. My girlfriend, who I'd been with for 15 months, had disappeared into thin air. And I went from being elated at having escaped, starvation in Toulouse to this desperate 19-year-old condition. And she basically had taken up with one of her friends. She went off to New Zealand with him, which was probably the best thing for her and the best thing for me. But I didn't feel that way at the time. I was absolutely distraught. And over a series of weeks, I ended up reading a Scientology book called Science of Survival by Ron Hubbard. And it seemed to make sense. It didn't have any of the, little spirits inhabiting you that you find out about much later. It didn't have any of the space opera, as Hubbard called it. It just seemed like a practical therapy. I later found out it was written by Richard DeMille, who was the son of Cecil B. DeMille, the great film director, and he worked with Hubbard and in fact wrote 3 of his books and then went off and became a psychology professor, which is why that book probably makes more sense than the others. I got into Scientology in Birmingham, in Moseley. People there were really lovely. They were all graduates of Bournemouth Polytechnic, as it was then, kind of art people, into English literature, what have you. And they really thought they'd found something life-changing that was going to make the world a wonderful place. It was going to end war, crime and insanity. And I caught that bug. I was involved for 9 years. I never worked for them. I was never on the staff. And I came to realise after I left that I was about the only person who wasn't humiliated or abused, because they have a policy about celebrities. And because I was a drummer, a writer, and a painter, they always, even though I didn't have any money, I was always treated in the same way that John Travolta or Chick Corea or Tom Cruise would be treated. So they were always, I wasn't locked in any rooms or didn't have any cold buckets of cold water thrown over me, all sorts of things that I found out about later that were being done in the group. In 1983, there was about half of the membership of Scientology left. Ron Hubbard's wife, Mary Sue Hubbard, had been sent to prison. She wrote a 200-page confession admitting false imprisonment, kidnapping, burglary, breaking and entering, stealing government credentials, you name it. She and 10 others went to prison in the US. There were convictions in Canada. A lot of us started wondering how on earth we'd become involved with something that claimed to be a religion, but actually had a functioning intelligence agency that had infiltrated governments all around the world, including the Home Office here. I named the 2 people who infiltrated the Home Office. I didn't get a reply to my letter. That was many years ago, in the 80s. So finding that out, but also there was this idea that Hubbard seemed to have disappeared. Ron Hubbard didn't seem to be there anymore. He couldn't appear publicly. I didn't know that was because there were 300 outstanding legal writs against him, so he didn't dare to appear publicly. So he seemed to have gone. Somebody else seemed to have taken over. It was getting very threatening and aggressive. It had always been stupidly expensive, and it got more so. When I started, it was £6 an hour to buy their hypnotic auditing. By the time I left, it was £120 an hour 9 years later. So I left with the idea of setting up Scientology outside the Scientology mother cult, if you like. And then I was deluged with documents about Hubbard's life that had been collected by a journalist called Michael Lynn Shannon. And it was about an 18-inch stack of documents. I read them and I realised that Hubbard was a liar. And Hubbard had said, honesty is sanity. And here he was being dishonest. And he'd said the road to truth must be trod with true steps. And here he was lying his head off. And I started to find the contradictions. I found myself in this bizarre position that I was protecting the independent Scientologists from the harassment of the Church of Scientology. And they had a full-on harassment department. All sorts of things that happened to me over the years. I've had 40 years of harassment from them. So I was defending the independents while no longer believing in Scientology. And that led me to research the history of Ron Hubbard. I wrote a book called, which is now called Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, which is a history of Scientology. And I couldn't get it published. 11 publishers said they wanted to do it, including Collins, who was the biggest publisher in the world. And the wife of Mr. Collins was a Scientologist, but they still wanted to do the book. They walked away basically saying there's no money in it. We'll produce this book, we'll be sued, and our legal costs will be way beyond any profits we can make. So 11 publishers said they were interested but wouldn't proceed. So then I was approached by Russell Miller, who at the time I think was the highest paid journalist in the UK, working at the Sunday Times. And he came along and said, I've got this commission to find Ron Hubbard and I want to hire you to help me. And he gave me money, which is always useful. He gave me £2,000. And then that week, Ron Hubbard died. And he'd already got the story with the Sunday Times. He got a commission for a book called Barefaced Messiah, which is an excellent biography of Hubbard. And I gave him my manuscript because I couldn't get it published. So about half of his book comes from mine. For 18 months, I was a consultant. So when it comes to the history of Scientology, it's a professor, Steve Kent, in Canada, who said in 1991, he said all future scholarship in Scientology will be based on Jon Atack's work. And then 5 years ago, he said all scholarship on Scientology has been based on Jon Atack's work. So that's, it just kept on going. They kept harassing me, so I wouldn't stop. If they hadn't harassed me, I'd have walked away. But you can see that they're really not what they represent themselves to be. Over the years, I've interviewed more than 1,000 people who are involved. And some of the horror stories, so for example, Scientology starts with Dianetics in 1950 with the idea that we've been traumatized, and by overcoming our trauma, we can become perfect. We can have fantastic intelligence, complete emotional resilience. We'll be impervious to viruses, according to Hubbard. We'll have photographic memories. These are the things he promised. They're none of them true. But that is what he says in 1950. By 1968, he's got a converted cattle ferry, which is called the Scotsman and later becomes the Apollo. He's in Corfu Harbour and he's throwing people overboard from 25 to 40 feet high. The high diving board, I think, is 14 feet in its swimming pools here. Often people who can't swim, they have their ankles tied together, they're blindfolded, and it could be that they've been 3 minutes late for a course. So he's now, what's more, the harbour at Corfu, of course, is where all the boats discharge their human sewage. So this guy who's going to cure trauma is now punishing people by throwing them into this. I'd never heard of that. When I first heard about it and I interviewed people it happened to, I still half didn't believe it. Then I found a publication, which is called The Auditor Number 41, by Scientology, with a picture of some being thrown overboard, and at the bottom of the page, photo credit L. Ron Hubbard. So he knew he was doing these things. And so you've got this group that are claiming to be saving mankind and elevating us all, but are in fact using dirty tricks at every stop and harming. I would say that the 4,000 members of their sea organization, that's sea as in SEA, a body of water, are slaves. They are physically and psychologically enslaved. They're not allowed to have children. Women are forced to have abortions. They work a 90 to 100-hour week. So you've got this perverse kind of mirror image of what it's claiming to be. From there, in the 90s, I did work on terrorism. I've written a book called Opening Our Minds, which is basically to say that the same mechanics that are used in Scientology are used in Al-Qaeda. They're used in the Moonies. They're used in mafia gangs. That it's partly about our desire to belong, which you talked about before we went on camera, that we all want to belong. The word religion literally means, from legare, as in ligament, to bind together. A religion is a set of ideas that bring people into a group. And we find that practice can be pushed too far. There are all sorts of tricks that can be used. So, for example, getting somebody to fix their perception, to stare at something. You'll bring about what's called the Ganzfeld effect. And that is that if you stare at something fixedly, you'll start to see colours drifting down the side of your perception. This technique is used as meditation in many groups, and it may be useful in helping people to relax, but it can also get people to hallucinate, and it can also make people more suggestible. Through repetition of something, so having a bunch of people drumming together or singing together, you can bring about altered states. You've got our need to belong, the fact that our educational system teaches obedience, rather than teaching intelligent disobedience, rather than teaching people to question things, it teaches people to simply obey. And then on top of that, which leads to groupthink, on top of that, there are techniques that amplify, our servitude, our submission. So that's what I've been doing. My most recent project, I've just finished a book tracing Aryan race theory to its origins in theosophy and showing the connection, therefore, between the origins of Scientology through Aleister Crowley and theosophy and the Nazis through the List Society, the Toolgesellschaft, which is where the Nazi Party was founded. So they come from the single man, a guy called Dr. Franz Hartmann, who is the beginnings of both the Nazi Aryan race theory and Scientology. So that's my current book.
So Hubbard, how did he get in? Why did he want to start Scientology?
Well, he became interested in magic and controlling people probably at the age of about 16. He told his oldest son that that's when he first read the Book of the Law by Aleister Crowley. So that would have been about 1927. He joined the Rosicrucian group, Amorc, the ancient and mystical order of the Rosy Cross, which isn't that ancient. It started in 1909 in California. He joined that. He did the first 2 neophyte degrees of that, which were about astral travel and how to leave your body and how to make other people do what you want fundamentally through magical intention. And he caught that bug that he wanted to become this thing, but where Aleister Crowley, for his considerable faults, was at least honest about what he was doing. Hubbard hid it. So he meets a guy called Jack Parsons in 1945. Hubbard would later claim that he was crippled and blinded at the end of his service, but he managed to drive the 400 miles down to LA, despite being blind and crippled. And in about August 1945, he goes to a party and meets John Whiteside Parsons, Jack Parsons. Parsons is an incredible genius. He was the inventor of solid rocket fuel, which played some part in the moon landings. The jet-assisted takeoff, that's him. He was a founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which we now know as NASA. So he's quite an interesting character, but he's also a follower of Aleister Crowley and runs a church of Thelema where he performs what is called sex magic. And they spell magic with a K for some reason. I've been told off actually for making jokes about Crowley's capricious spelling. I do understand that it was done because he was into numerology, and by adding the letters up, you get certain numbers. It's, but I don't think we should take these things too literally. But so they perform these ceremonies where basically Jack Parsons masturbates while Ron Hubbard intones certain things. They were all recorded. This is in January to March 1946, and Parsons transcribed them. And these days, Crowleyites talk about the Book of Babylon, which is what these ceremonies were meant to be. What they were trying to do is incarnate the whore of Babylon, the spoken of in the Book of Revelation, and the Antichrist. They were trying to bring Armageddon, they were trying to bring the end of the world, and they wanted it under their control. The ceremonies are very clear. There's no doubt this is what they're trying to do. Spoiler alert, it didn't happen. Not yet. Hubbard from there took the ideas of Aleister Crowley, grabbed hold of a bit of abandoned Freud, which is pretty much what his original Dianetics was. Now Freud had actually described this whole method in lectures in America in, I think, 1911, the Worcester, Massachusetts lectures. And he said, this is the method we started with. You count people back into a state where their eyelids flicker and you start being able to use what's called a repeater technique, where you get them to repeat certain sentences. You're looking for trauma. You're looking for them to abreact, to relive trauma that's happened to them in the past. This was very big in the military at the end of the Second War. Hubbard encountered probably the works of Grinker and Spiegel, 2 psychiatrists working in North Africa, and they were getting people to relive memories under the influence of phenobarbital, the barbiturate. Hubbard was prescribed phenobarbital. Hubbard, in a lecture which Scientology has published, admitted to having been addicted to phenobarbital. So that part of it we know. Freud dismissed the technique because it said it makes people more dependent rather than less dependent. So this was where Hubbard started. He then loses that because he's being pursued by the New Jersey Medical Association. He's being sued for practicing medicine without a license. He's also spent all of the money from the 5 foundations he started. His public reputation is in tatters because his second and bigamous wife, who he stole from Jack Parsons, is suing for divorce and saying he tortured her. So, for example, he hit her so hard one day that he fractured her eustachian tube, so she was deaf in one ear. So he's got all of this stuff going on. He sold 150,000 books. The publisher's withdrawn the book because he says it's fraudulent and commissioned a doctor who worked with Hubbard to write about why it's fraudulent, why the claims are not based on anything scientific. It's called Modern Science of Mental Health. There's no science involved. He's lost everything, and he has to create something new. He sold Dianetics to get out from under the various charges against him. So he creates Scientology. February 1952. He goes to Phoenix, Arizona, sets this thing up, and basically translates Crowleyite ideas into a different jargon. So where Crowley will talk about thelema, the will, the intention, the ability to make somebody else do what you want just by thinking it, to make the world transform, the magical transformation, Hubbard calls that intention. And so Scientology offers to teach you how to intend things and make them happen. Pretty much like The Secret or Christian Science, so many, the New Thought movement, lots of ideas of this type have come along. And he is selling you that and the idea that you can leave your body, which is a fundamental idea to Masons, Rosicrucians, Theosophists, astral travel, the etheric body, all sorts of ideas. But again, he calls it exteriorization.
Just change the word then?
Yeah, exactly. Just reframe these ideas and then set up all of these hypnotic processes. And where transcendental meditation has 2 procedures, Scientology has 2,000. You go through all of this elaborate stuff, and what's actually happening are hypnotic inductions to make you believe certain things. If you can have somebody who's been in Scientology and spent, the most I've heard of was $2 million that somebody has spent. There are donations to Scientology. A couple called Bob and Trish Duggan claim they've given $340 million to Scientology. And these people spend decades doing this stuff, and you say, well, show me one of the magic tricks. Make Jon Atack stop talking or make him disappear. I used to, when I gave lectures, I put a little bit of tinfoil on the table and say, of course, as Scientology, they're exterior, so of course they're watching me all the time. And if this tinfoil moves 1 centimetre during the course of the lecture, I will believe that Scientology works. It never did. So the idea that you can blow up planets and, it's hogwash. But they create the state of mind in people where they believe they have these skills. So they'll say, I can change traffic lights, that's a common one, or I can make clouds move. And you're going, if you can make 2 tons of water up in the air move, you can move a bit of tinfoil a centimetre, show me. But they create a mindset where people believe these things and become fanatical and become willing to infiltrate government agencies, kidnap people, falsely imprison people, and fundamentally try and harass critics into silence rather than having dialogue with us.
Having a conversation of what is your theories, how do you get your theories, how do they work?
Yeah.
But I think that's the same as, and I don't want to offend people who are religious, but it's the same as religion. It's a belief into something, what you're reading or what other people are saying is right. If you look at the Bible or the Quran, there's some weird magical stuff, some dark stuff, but there's some beautiful things as well. But there's still stuff where you think, well, Jesus resurrected after, was it 40 days and came out of a tomb?
3 days.
3 days. Like, you think, well, is that true? But people believe that as well.
And curiously, there are different versions of it within the Gospels themselves, which contradict them. So there's a letter from Paul that seems to suggest that it wasn't the physical body that rose, but some kind of astral or etheric body that was seen. It's one of the letters of Paul. It's right there. It's not a matter really of people can believe what they like, and that's absolutely fine, as long as their beliefs don't then lead them to declare, the 1,000-year Reich, and to issue orders, as Himmler did, to kill 30 million Slavs. And they did. They pretty much made their target there. I think they got to 27 million people. So when a belief turns to a practice, and when that practice is hateful towards other human beings, that's where we're in trouble. I think we've agreed nobody knows what's really going on.
Yeah.
We've spent our lives trying to understand. I've come to a point where I'm no longer concerned. I'm perfectly happy the way I am and with the understanding I have. But it was only in my 50s, I'm 70 now, it's only in my 50s that I gave up on the pursuit of enlightenment, which I first met when I was 17 and went, well, it might happen, but it's never going to happen to me.
What was the Jesus 40 Days and 40 Nights? What was that then?
That's the meditation on the way to getting the disciples and starting his mission.
Is that where I get that from? I just remember from school it was something
number
to do with 40 days or 40 nights.
40 days eating locusts in the desert.
So Scientology for yourself then, what's the steps to get into it? Can anybody join, or is it, like you says, you kind of believed in the methods from the first book? And I think that just goes with anything in life. It just depends what mood or time scale you're in, whether that's losing a relationship, losing a loved one. Some people can gravitate towards alcohol or drugs just at that moment. Nobody's safe from anything negative or positive in this life. You just don't know the circumstances. Like that just moment for you, that book made sense. So, but what is the steps to get involved with Scientology? I believe there's a place in London that people can just walk in and out, have a look and and can speak to people. But what was the steps back then in the 50s and 60s?
Look, I got in 74, and by which time they had a determined method, which they call the dissemination drill of recruiting people. You are absolutely right that it's when you're in transition that you're vulnerable. And that transition can be positive. You can just got a great new job. You can just move to a wonderful place. But there's something about our routines that when we're taken out of where we are and the way we normally behave, and often, that will be the end of a relationship or losing a job or something bad. But it doesn't matter, positive or negative, that's the point where we become vulnerable to change. And somebody comes along and they seem really happy and bright and friendly, what's called love bombing by the Moonies. They tell you how wonderful you are. If you look to Al-Qaeda we have an Al-Qaeda recruiting manual, and it's remarkably similar to the approach that's used by Scientology. You don't disagree with the person at all when you're recruiting them. Yeah? Anything they say that you disagree with, you just let it go. Something that therapists will talk about as well. You create a rapport with a person. You seek to establish, in Scientology, you check to see if they've been told anything negative about Scientology, and you dismiss that by saying, well, that's the media. Who trusts the media? That always worked for me over 9 years. Whenever anybody brought up anything about Scientology, you just say, who trusts the media? And people go, oh, yeah, you're right. Which is difficult because having reviewed more than 1,000 news pieces about Scientology, most of them are accurate. So, you're plugging into mainstream media, fake news or something like that. The poodle press, that's what the Rajneeshis call it, which goes back probably, our distrust of the media goes back to the Christmas truce in 1914 when Saxon soldiers and English soldiers started playing football together. And what happened after that was that cameras were banned in the trenches. Fraternization, you'd be shot. So at that point, people were getting letters still that were uncensored, and what they saw in the newspapers about the war and what they saw from the Tommies was different. So I think public trust in the media collapsed at that point and has never recovered, which is unfortunate because, as I say, I've worked on at least 250 media pieces about Scientology. I've been startled at how accurate journalists have been, having been fed this idea. Even I did a piece with The Sun, who didn't have the best of reputation at the time, but every word they printed was true. So, we have this automatic dismissal of media.
And that's understandable because
they've lied so often.
Yeah, there's some great journalists, there's some great independent journalists who do great investigation work, but it will just never have that 100% stamp of approval because of what they've done in the media for so long. They've manipulated the masses. But again, as humans, we're so easily manipulated, we're so easily controlled. Look at lockdown, everybody shut up, bang pots and pans, celebrate. But really, when nobody asked the real question, why are we locked in my house? Why are we buying toilet paper? And that just, again, run out of toilet paper. Instead of people buying pastas or tinned food to stop from starvation, they're buying toilet paper because if you start to death, I can assure you, you ain't going to be doing the toilet. So it's just, that's where I sit back and go, something ain't right. I've got to question. And sometimes it's not healthy questioning everything. Like, it's so damaging, it's so draining.
I can end up mad.
Because you end up losing yourself and forgetting to live. But you've just got to, because like you say, everything from whether it's Scientology or Al-Qaeda or Hitler, everything's a form of manipulation. You're believing in this person, you're believing in this book, you're believing in this scripture, you're believing in something, you're believing in the media. But yet, as a human, you feel fooled. But a sad reality is, they'll be fooled again because they don't learn their lesson.
No, it's true. I mean, the man who wrote Won't Get Fooled Again, Pete Townsend, also produced Tommy, the rock opera, which is really a great statement about cults. When you look at the sleeve, it's dedicated to Meher Baba, who was his guru. So it's like, definitely one blind kid.
So what was it like involved in Scientology? Were you happy? Were you kind of just going through the motions? And I'm going to ask another question, but how many levels is there in Scientology? Obviously, you've got the Masons, you've got different kinds of levels, you've got all these different ranks in the army or whatever. Has Scientology got levels, or is it only one level?
Yeah, absolutely. It like the Freemasons, you've got, there'd be some argument about how you number them. I numbered 28 in total. There were 27. When I left, I'd done 25 of them. And that 25th level includes the material from the 26th and the 27th. So I did everything that was there. I'm aware of what their 28th level is, which is absolute nonsense. But so, yeah, I did the lot, pretty much.
And what's the first level?
You see, that's the point where it becomes questionable, because there are little courses you do, and the first thing you'll do will usually be the communication course, the training routines. This is not considered one of the levels. So you have two bridges, according to Hubbard. One of them is the training, where you learn to do it to people, and the other is receiving it. And it becomes very complicated as to what belongs to what. So you'll start with training routines, and the very first drill you do comes from Aleister Crowley. Hubbard doesn't admit this, nor does Scientology, and you sit pretty much as we're sitting now, a little bit closer together, 3 feet it says, and you sit with your eyes closed until you can be there comfortably and confront. I'm not sure how you confront anything with your eyes closed. Then you do it with your eyes open, and it says you do that for some hours. And in fact, it does say that you're not meant to blink, which is physically impossible. And your eyes, I met people who'd fallen off their chairs trying to do this in the early 70s. They became less rigid about that around the time I joined, thankfully. But you then do a drill where you, called Training Routine 1, where you will take lines from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland and declare them. And the idea is to make sure that your enunciation is clear, that you can be heard. Not a bad idea. Then you do Training Routine 2, where you learn to acknowledge anything that's said to you. So you go, fine, thank you, good, I got that, to end a cycle of communication, as they say. So there, the coach will read lines from Alice in Wonderland, and you say, fine, good. They go, off with their heads, and you say, good. Then you have Training Routine 3, where you learn to get your questions answered, and the 2 questions you use will be either do birds swim, do birds fly, do fish swim. Got that one the wrong way around. And you just repeat that until you get an answer. You don't vary the wording at all. This is starting to train you in how you will audit other people, where you will use an exact script without varying it. Then the last of those drills is training routine 4, where you learn to do that without distraction. And I've missed one out, which is training routine bull bait, which comes after training routine 0, before training routine 1, where somebody will sit and insult you, try and provoke you, try and get you to change, and you're meant to sit there, wooden-faced, without any movement. It's very interesting because people do often feel more confident after they've done these drills. What they're not understanding is that they're being trained into inducing a state, which some people would call a hypnotic state. You're being taught not to react, and you're being taught to have a fixed state. After I left, I'd had 9 years of it, and you're meant to have locked on eye contact with all the time with everybody you talk to. This is what's called the Charles Manson stare, and that's where he learned it in the 14 months of Scientology he did. When I left, realizing I was doing this, I decided I was going to stop doing it. It took me 6 months to stop doing it.
What does that mean? Because obviously if I'm doing interviews, now that you've said that, I'm thinking, right, where do I look? I like to look at people's eyes or their faces to guide the story. So,
but you don't stare. You don't have locked on eye contact. Of course, that locked on eye contact is taught in the military and in the police as a way of facing somebody down. It's the predator stare. It's the way of saying, I'm the boss. It's what a cat will do when it's looking at a mouse. It will. And you're being taught to do this thing. What I found was that after I stopped doing it and regained control of my eye movements, I noticed so much more. That was the amazing thing. So that when you're busily locking on eye contact with somebody, you don't really see them as well as you see them if you scan. And it's natural for us to scan. It's natural for us to be checking the environment all the time to make sure there's nothing dangerous in it. So what's happening, even at that earlier stage, my friend Steve Hassan, who's a leading cult expert, when he was first shown training routine 0, he's a highly trained hypnotherapist. And he said, this is the most overt use of hypnotism I've ever seen in a cult group, having studied hundreds of them. So right at the beginning, hypnotic induction is being used on you that will change your state of mind and will change the way you perceive the world.
So you're being brainwashed?
It's a controversial word, but to
think and act the way they want their beliefs is. Was there anything more sinister to it? You people talk now about the Masons and the Illuminati and talk about sacrifices. Now, people need to get this right. Not all Masons are bad. You've got the local Masons who maybe work for the council, or you get builders that can maybe help each other. Obviously, there's more levels to it and more layers. I don't know how deep it goes. I can only watch videos or maybe read books and have my own perception. But was there anything on these 28 steps in Scientology where you thought, no, this is becoming a bit too much? Or was it all kind of brain techniques and methods to how to take control?
There's a kind of Rubicon that you cross that you do the secret levels. So everything up to what's called grade 5 is open. You can see the materials. Everything after that is secret, and then you get on to, so you declared a clear. I was told I was a natural clear. I was told I'd always been clear. I'd been involved for 7 years when this happened. That then gave me access, once I'd paid the money, to what are called the operating thetan levels. There are 8 of those now. There were 7 when I was involved. And they in fact changed. The content of them changed while I was involved. And there you were taught that the big secret, which was first made public in the early 70s by an ex-member called Robert Kaufman, the big secret is that it's meant to, 75 million years ago, in this sector of the galaxy, an evil prince called Xenu rounded up the inhabitants of 176 planets and brought them to Earth, which was then called Tigiak, and put their spirits on electronic ribbons collected their spirits on electronic ribbons after blowing them up with hydrogen bombs in volcanoes on the Canary Islands and Hawaii, neither of which actually existed 75 million years ago. They both erupted about 9 million years ago. But we won't get into, we don't need to be
The
too
specifics.
detailed. Then there are 36 days of implanting, which are the society as of 1966, when Hubbard wrote this. So you've got all of the images are up to then, and they printed some of them in an attempt to get people to subliminally be tempted in Scientology. And you can see that there'll be a DC-8 aeroplane, the 1966 Douglas Connell aeroplane. There'll be people in fedora hats that, So, and according to Hubbard, in this material, all of which I'm highly familiar with, I did the level when I was there, and I've subsequently reviewed the material many times. You are implanted into the modern society, including the implant of the Christian religion. Hubbard said Scientology is completely compatible with Christianity, and he also said Christianity was implanted 75 million years ago. There was no Christ. He makes the specific statement, there was no Christ. So that's where things start getting wacky, that you get to this level and you're told that you are a collection, a huge collection of clusters of spirits, which he calls body thetans. His word Satan is his word for the spirit, the thetan, the self. So you are a composite being of thousands or even millions of these, and OT3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 are all to do with shedding these body thetans. It's fair to say that at the very end of his life, there was a guy called Sarge Fouth who was with Hubbard in the last weeks of his life, and Hubbard told him that he'd failed and that he was being taken over by the body thetans, and he wanted Fouth to create a machine that would electrocute him and allow him to die and separate himself from the body thetans. So by his own confession at the end, it had failed completely. Personally, I don't believe we are inhabited by demons, body thetans, or anything of the type. There's no evidence that supports that view. But if you can persuade somebody that they've got an enemy inside them that they don't know about, whether you call it the unconscious mind or a demon or whatever, you've made somebody very controllable. When you say, well, I can help you get over the thing that is thwarting all of your desires and all of the things you want to do, this hidden enemy within. So, whether that's a psychotherapist or a Scientologist or an exorcist, whatever it is, I am highly skeptical of that view.
How many members were there when you were involved in the 70s?
I left in 83. By that time, there were probably about 40,000 around the world.
Which is quite a lot, though.
They claimed 11 million, but they were also counting the body thetans, obviously.
But that's still a lot of people involved. Would you go down the route of being it more of a cult than how would you describe Scientology?
Well, it's certainly a cult, but I would go to the dictionary definition of a cult, which is a group that's devoted to a teaching or a leader. It doesn't mean something bad. So Christianity is the cult of Christ. The word has come to include the idea of it being destructive. So is Scientology a destructive cult? Absolutely. I've dealt with hundreds of people whose lives were ruined by Scientology. I had a guy who'd given them £35,000 that he'd borrowed, and he told me he'd be working 2 jobs for 10 years to pay it back, so that they could purchase a building. And in return, he was going to have a free car parking space for all eternity at that building. So but I've met, there are deaths. The suicide rate in Scientology in 1993, I did a survey of 38 suicides I was running a group called FactNet, a US nonprofit then, or I was the president of it, I wasn't running it. And they commissioned me to do this thing. And I figured that the suicide rate in Scientology was about 10 times the normal UK or US average. So that's amazingly dangerous, because people are being taught that if you die, you can just go and pick up another body. And this was also something that infected the Manson family, that they'd come to this point of view that it was fine to kill people
Yeah, so they've tapped into the brain to say, listen, you don't like this body, you can go elsewhere, you kill this person, you get this sort of stuff, where it's not like black magic, but it's severe manipulation for them people. Do you believe it's not people who are struggling with their mental health? You just believe people are just want a different body. So they've believed that if you take your own life, you just come straight back in, like reincarnation.
Yeah, and they're at a low spot. Also, Scientology screens out anybody with a psychiatric history. So I met a young man who had, in a moment of desperation, because he'd been told by Scientology that he wouldn't recover, he'd jumped in front of an express train. And the cop said he was the only person they'd ever seen survive that experience. But I also had a situation with a young woman who had committed suicide. And by the side of her bed, they found a personality test, a Scientology personality test. And what they don't tell you, when I did the personality test, at the very beginning, the person marking it said, "I'm not going to mark you down." And I had no idea of 10 years what that meant. Then I got hold of the manual that they use to evaluate things. And they say, if you're above the midline, you reverse the score. So I had plus 80 to 90% along all of my tests. That would normally have been reversed to minus 80 to 90%. This young woman had been told that she was a hopeless failure. She couldn't afford Scientology. She killed herself. So it can be very dangerous. There are also situations of suicide where people have just been pushed to their limit. There was a woman called Lee Johnston who had a 2-year-old baby, and she was baby watched. They knew she was suicidal, so they had a woman called Ivis Bolger living with her to stop her from killing herself. As soon as she got the chance, she took her life. I spent like 18 months investigating that, and if the Express newspapers were interested in it and had me doing it, it didn't pay me anything either. But in the end, the threatening letters from Lee Johnston's mum and Scientology saying the story was never made public, and I say 38 people that I investigated back then. There have been many more since.
What was the friendship in that like? We found out, was it like a family? Was it like, there must have been positives from it as well, because people who are in it for 30, 40 years are still there and they preach high of it. They say it's a great thing. So was there a time involvement in it where life was going good and you were happy? Like there must have been some positives with the friendship and the kind of brotherhood or the family that it brings.
Yeah, and I think that happens with almost any group that you can join
to feel part of something.
Yeah, that if you interview people who worked as torturers, and you probably have done,
Many.
I have too, you find there's a camaraderie among them. There's an amazing documentary about Indonesia and the massacres there, where the torturers have a reunion and they're joking about how they kill people. So you can, that camaraderie. I didn't torture anybody in Scientology. Other than by talking about it probably and trying to recruit them. But yeah, there was a sense that you had this precious, wonderful technology that was going to save humanity, and that bound you to the other people. What you didn't see was what was happening behind the veil. On the one hand, that you've got this massive intelligence agency, hundreds of people infiltrating governments all over the world and stealing material and committing various other crimes. And you'd also got the Sea Organization, who were these smiling people who were desperately trying to sell you this stuff because they got a 2% commission when they did, which nobody told me about at the time, who weren't telling you that they'd spent the last 6 months eating only rice and beans. There's no... So you're in this bubble where you feel you're doing some good. But I would say that, no, I was never really happy. The one thing I did get very early on from Scientology, which separated me from other Scientologists, was the idea that you were meant to become self-determined. You were meant to make your own decisions. So finding that these people in this organization had signed a contract for 1 billion years, 1,000 million years to come back life after life, and that they agreed to follow and uphold command intention. That's the wording of their code. Kind of going, but I thought we came here to be self-determined. Hubbard also said that the artist is the most important person in the society. the goodness in society, what he called theta, is injected by the artist. So every time they tried to recruit me, I'd say, no, I'm an artist. So that part, becoming bullshit, becoming single-minded about my aspirations, that was something that came from Hubbard's ideas. It wasn't something I saw other Scientologists doing. They gave in, they joined this organization, they spent all their money, they, fell by the wayside one way or another. And the people who've been in for 30 or 40 years, there is a fanaticism to the way they behave. They certainly can't have a conversation with me. They're forbidden to talk to me. So you've got something that's saying, Hubbard's saying, more communication, not less, is the answer. Don't communicate with these people. You have them attesting this state, which they call the communication release, where you can talk freely to anyone on any subject, as long as that person's not been labeled a suppressive person by Hubbard. As long as you don't talk about the upper levels of Scientology, as long as you don't talk about your own problems, you're not allowed to talk about your problems to anybody but the person who is auditing you. And on and on and on, all of these restrictions that are placed on you. And within that, I don't think I've ever met a happy Scientologist. After I left, and the first year after I left, everybody I talked with, and hundreds of people, I would ask them, what convinced you that Scientology was a good idea? When did you become a member? What was the thing that happened? And what have you gained from it? What did you want to get from it? And what have you got from it? And it was amazing. Nobody had achieved, with hundreds of people, nobody had achieved what they'd set out to achieve or what they'd been promised. They were kind of hanging on desperately. And the most usual story was that very early on, they'd had a euphoric experience. Scientologists call it having very good indicators. And that euphoric experience is very much like a drug hit. You get high on this stuff, you feel incredible. And, I did talk with people who'd had bizarre experiences, but they were largely experiences of elation. We use the word ecstasy in our language, which literally means standing beside yourself, to be ecstatic, to be outside of yourself. And people can quite naturally have that experience, or they can take ayahuasca or LSD and have that experience. But I talk with people who are going, yeah, I felt fantastic. I felt like I was 20 feet high. And you go, well, that's typical hypnotic effect. That's, you can read that in any textbook on, colors getting brighter, things seeming more real, more solid. These are effects of the mind. Once somebody's had that experience, they continue to chase it. They become Scientology junkies. They want that experience. And as with other destructive cults, they will abandon everything to do that. So they will not look after their children properly, for example. They won't spend time with their spouse. Their determination is to get this phenomenal, magical state where they'll be able to command the universe to do whatever they want. And of course, none of them achieve that.
So it's like an addiction.
Yes, it's like an addiction. You then got the sunk cost fallacy, throwing good money after bad. I've invested this much of my life and this much money. It's got to be true. And it isn't. Quite simply, you don't achieve any of the things that are promised to you.
And how long does it take does the penny drop? Well, it can't drop for everyone, because I'd imagine people live and die by it. What percentage of people in Scientology do you think the penny drops and think, I've done 10, 20 years, I've done hundreds of thousands of pounds, I don't have any of these magical features that I'm promised? Does the penny drop for a lot of people involved in Scientology?
I think people just become ever more committed, but probably between 1 and 3 million people have done some Scientology. The current International Association of Scientologists has 20,000 members. So the statement is basically that there are 20,000 of them, 1 to 3 million people have left one way or another.
How much are they worth?
I would say probably about $3 billion.
So they've got a good few quid then.
There's a guy called Jeffrey Augustine who runs a thing called the Money Project. He also happens to be a Freemason of quite high degree, and he's a good friend of mine. So I don't hold that against him. But he's done brilliant work looking into their finances and showing where the money's coming from and going to.
What about the silent birth? What is that? Because I know Tom Cruise, is it Katie Holmes?
Yeah.
I think she exposed that about the silent birth. Like, what is that in Scientology terms?
Well, the idea from the very beginning in Dianetics is that the most traumatic things that have happened to you, this is before they started teaching reincarnation or past lives, the most traumatic things that have happened to you will have happened in the womb or at birth. And what they believe is that during periods of unconsciousness, we record what's said and done around us, and then that is replayed unconsciously. And that's what causes us to behave in a crazy way. So the idea is that anything that is said around a baby being born will be recorded, and they will in some way later act this out. It's absolute nonsense. We know enough about memory now to know, firstly, that a baby can't form memories because the brain structure isn't there to do it. You're about 5 years old by the time the fundamental architecture of the brain is there. You might have a few stray memories before that. But the other thing we know about memory is we know how it's laid down. We know about the chemical process. And if you talk to somebody, say talk to a boxer who's been knocked out, ask them to tell you about the 10 seconds before they were knocked out. And they usually can't remember because memory is laid down after the fact. So the reality is that if somebody knocks you out, you're not recording what's going on around you. And in fact, Scientology has only ever once tried to prove this idea, which it's been selling all of these years. In 1950 in Los Angeles, they did an experiment which Hubbard talks about, and I've got the actual papers that were released at the time, which are not broadly available. And they knocked somebody out deliberately and then said something to him and tried to recover it. They were unable to do it. So there's never been any proof of this idea, but the silent birth comes out of that.
They're not allowed any medication, nothing like that? Silent birth?
No, in Scientology, although Hubbard was a multiple drug abuser who admitted, as I say, publicly to having been addicted to barbiturates, who advocated the use of amphetamines, who he was an alcoholic by the end of his life. He smoked 100 cigarettes a day, but he said, you mustn't take drugs. So there's this
contradiction.
Yeah, massive, massive contradiction.
A lot of these kind of leaders, though, and generals are all sort of addicted to something.
It often seems to be the case, doesn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
Hitler, of course, both amphetamines and cocaine.
Mm-hmm. You seen him at the Olympics with his leg shaking.
That's Parkinson's. So
I think that's a lot of pressure with the lies, the deceit, and just something's not right where they just have to take something externally to fix something internally. Like, why is a lot of these dictators kind of addicted to something?
I think it's part, I think that it's often, because they can't stand reality. And they want to be in another state. Looking at somebody, say, like Mussolini, and there's a Ruth Ben Gilead wrote a book called Strong Men. She's an expert on Italian history. And there are only two books in my life that I've had to just put down because I couldn't take anymore. One was a biography of Mao Zedong and his torture practices, what he liked to do with red hot wires and men's genitalia. It's like, I decided to stop reading that book. And the same with Ruth Ben Gilead, that I had to put the book down because Mussolini 4 times a day, fairly regularly, would rape a woman. But his idea of rape was a 10-minute violent exchange, and then he'd walk away from it, satisfied what he'd done. Gaddafi, when you look at him, that there's something incredibly twisted. There's something that he's wanting to get out of life that we wouldn't. And when you look to psychopaths, they need more extreme experiences than other people, and thusly some of them become serial killers so that they can, get a buzz in the only way they know how. And that will then, of course, if the FBI are right with the Mindhunter program, it will escalate. They will have to kill more and more. They'll get to the point, as with Jeffrey Dahmer, where they haven't disposed of the last body before going and doing the next one because they've become addicted to this buzz. So I think it's a defect in human personality that when you are dissatisfied with life, it's very easy to latch onto a substance and take that.
It's like if you're chasing fame or fortune, when you get it, nothing what you get after it is never enough. That's why you'll see all your superstars, Michael Jackson, Elvis, Whitney Houston, Justin Bieber's, they're just too big. They've just achieved, I wouldn't say achieved too much, but when they get all that fame and fortune, they realise that that's not what it's about, and they really struggle. Tyson Fury, who I've mentioned many times, won all the belts, had all the money, got all the fame, and ended up in the biggest depression of his life after he beat Klitschko. Like, there is something with the mind. Is that not showing enough gratitude or appreciation for what you have? Like, how does it really slip, you know?
I think maybe the reason that people, they see Tom Cruise and get into Scientology is because they think Tom Cruise has achieved something special by being a Hollywood star. And we've got this idea that these people must have some magical quality. A friend of mine who was over a couple of weeks ago, she worked with Travolta for 15 years. She worked with Mel Gibson after that. She works now with other very famous celebrities. And so she sees just how fallible they are. These people it's too much to have people on the street thinking that you're all that, when you know that you're just a human being. You haven't achieved any superpowers. You've just done something very successful. And as you say, I mean, look at John Lennon. He's another example of somebody who achieved something incredible and could never be happy with himself, could never resolve that, and instead went after Paul McCartney instead.
It's just when you look at it, it's all strange how we shouldn't be idolising anyone. We shouldn't be idolising, because it makes us feel inadequate, it makes us feel not worthy or not good enough, and social media does enough of that now, where people feel as if their life just ain't good enough, their life just ain't as good as that person has shown off. But the majority of people on social media has struggles with mental health issues, including myself. It's like a mental asylum, and I always preach that because it's so important. We're not living life. It's took us away from life. It's took us away from the meaning of life, which is so important, to be out in nature and connect with people, and we're just becoming so disconnected. Tom Cruise, if I'm honest, I look at Tom Cruise and I think he's got it sussed. Does all his own stunts, he's still hitting blockbuster movies, looks great for it in his 60s. It just seems he's at the top of his game, and he's been in that industry for 40 years. There's not many survived the way he has. No. So if he speaks about Scientology, you're thinking, well, maybe that is got the keys and tools and techniques to be successful, because he seems to be switched on. I believe he's dyslexic. I believe maybe anybody can be easily manipulated, but he does seem at the top of his game, still hitting blockbuster movies. So how did he end up getting involved in Scientology, and how big is he for recruiting? Because if he was to promote it, and I've watched interviews with him as well, when he was having a debate with the news guy, and he was talking about pharmaceutical drugs, and he was spot on. Like, I believe that, what he was saying. So
Ritalin.
Yeah, Ritalin he was talking about, and he's saying, listen, you don't know the damage this is causing. Like, he seemed very on it, very switched on. But how big is he for Scientology?
Well, hugely. It's important to say that, as with many other Scientology celebrities, he was already a celebrity. He'd already been in movies when he was recruited. He was recruited because he had a relationship with Mimi Rogers, who was a Scientologist and relatively successful actress. And she took him in. He, has dyslexia, and he felt that he was helped with that. But if you want to get inside his life, Leah Remini, who knew him in her book Troublemaker, writes about an encounter with Tom Cruise, and he's a screaming maniac. He's basically, he wants to make cookies, and he's got 4 Scientology handlers who live with him and are with him all the time, make sure all of his wishes are granted. And he wants to make cookies, and he can't see the cookie dough, and he starts screaming. And the assistant has to say, well, it's over here. So he's a petty tyrant. He's not a developed, sane, loving human being. A lot of my friends would say, oh, you shouldn't watch his movies. I think many of the movies he's made, say The Colour of Money, or Rain Man, or Jerry Maguire, or Magnolia, which I think is a superb film, and he plays the role of a cult con man extremely well in it, without realising that he's actually following a script that's been run on him. So he's not enlightened. He has nothing to share. He's a good actor within those roles. He's probably not the greatest actor of the generation. I think he looks up to Jack Nicholson, or you'd say Philip Seymour Hoffman in his generation. There are people who have a greater diversity of roles. He can play that sharp con man that he plays in Jerry Maguire, Rain Man, Colour of Money, beautifully. He's really convincing. And as you say, he does his own stunts so far. But that means he's a good actor and a good stuntman. It doesn't mean, he's had a series of failed marriages. Nicole Kidman's still keeping quiet. And in terms of acting chops, I would say that she's one of the great actors of the generation, Nicole Kidman. I don't think he is. I think he's somebody who's solid, reliable, makes good movies. But he's not, I don't know.
Daniel Day-Lewis.
Yeah, they're perfect example. He's not Daniel Day-Lewis, exactly so.
But he seems to hit every movie. Even you go back to like Cocktail, Days of Thunder, Far and Away with Nicole Kidman. What was the movie? The Three Cogs in the Water. And they could see the future. Minority Report. What a movie that is.
Philip K. Dick.
Yeah, unbelievable movie.
As well.
Unbelievable movie. Like, you actually look at that. That's a potential for happening in the next 20, 30, 40 years. That
people are trying to work on it, and it'll go wrong for the reasons. Of course.
Everything goes wrong. Nothing's 100%, but we're actually seeing that now where the thought police are jailing people for thoughts alone of what they're saying on social media and not acting on it. But the way that movie was written, it was unbelievable. Colin Farrell played a great part, but
great actor.
Do you think he's playing himself then? And do you think it's so hard because all his movies are blockbusters, he's very fit, do you think he's been brainwashed then from that woman who's then recruited him? If he's already famous, so why would he join Scientology if he's already got all the answers?
The same reason anybody would. He was a very young man at the time. He was offered something. He was recruited through a Scientology organization in Los Angeles called the Celebrity Center, which is run differently from other Scientology organizations. They're very kid glove, handling, you'll get whatever you want. You are, of course, love bombed. You're told that you're absolutely wonderful, and you're put into this sort of cotton wool environment. As I say, he has 4 Scientologists,
servants,
who are basically there to do whatever he wants and to make sure. So,
male or female?
I think that will vary. I don't think there's anything sexual involved.
Yeah, I was just about to ask that. Is it a case of, listen, I want to sleep with you, or get my dinner made, or drive me here?
Yeah.
Are they just there possibly as plants to keep him on the straight and narrow as well, where he feels as if he's like a king, possibly? Where they plant these people to say, you've cracked it, you've got these 4 people working for you, but they're really keeping him in line? Or am I a bit far-fetched there?
No, that's absolutely right. That's their function, to make sure that nobody dislodges him. Hubbard wrote that anybody who causes a celebrity to leave Scientology will be up in for it. It's policy in Scientology. You could serve for 2 years or more on Scientology's rehabilitation project force, which is a gulag, a prison force, if something you'd said had caused somebody to leave. So John Travolta, of course, around about 1982, left Scientology, went to Rolling Stone and said, it's a terrible thing, it's been taken over by these awful people. And his story was that during an auditing session one day, the auditor, the guy doing the process, left the room. Travolta climbed out of the window to escape. And then he was persuaded that it was not in his best interest to speak out against Scientology. And then he nominally rejoined Scientology. But as far as I can tell, he hasn't actually done any Scientology courses for about 30 years.
His career took a dive. He was nowhere to be seen. And then I think he'd done Pulp Fiction for like £5,000 or £10,000, and then it boomed his career again. It'll be interesting to see when his career dropped, if he was out of Scientology and then became popular again.
He was only out very briefly, and so along the way, of course, Saturday Night Fever, 77, somewhere around there. He never, Pulp Fiction is the other film we think of, and he's brilliant in it. Yeah. I'm not a fan of Saturday Night Fever because of its content, but he's brilliant in it. He's remarkable.
He done Grease as well, but his movies did get better. I think he done like Face Off and stuff with Nicolas Cage, but it's interesting to see where his life dived if it came out of Scientology. What is their roles in it then? The high end celebrities, if they get certain roles to play?
Yeah, they're expected to promote Scientology. So Cruise insisted, I don't know if he still does, but he insisted that everybody on the crew read Ron Hubbard's Dianetics, Modern Science and Mental Health. Everybody on the crew. He insists that all the movies are recorded not with Dolby, but with clear sound, which is a system that was patented to Hubbard, though he didn't develop it. There is this tremendous influence. And in Hollywood, for decades now, I can remember being over in LA in, I think it was 91, and Premiere Magazine had just done a feature on how loathed Scientologists are in Hollywood. You know, the way they force themselves upon crew and make things happen. So they're deeply unpopular. But you had, then you get, say, Paul Haggis. Paul Haggis has 2 Oscars. He wrote the script for $1 Million Baby, and he directed Crash. And I think in each case it's right that he got an Oscar. But he, after years of involvement, more than 20 years of involvement in Scientology, went, it's a bad thing. And he particularly was bothered, his daughter is gay, and he was bothered about Scientology's attitude towards gay people. Hubbard was very thoroughly homophobic, no two ways about it. He said all homosexuals are backstabbers. So Haggis got into it with them, and then he came away from it.
Could he have potentially been gay, Hubbard?
Oh, Robert Heinlein, the science fiction writer, Robert Heinlein's wife, said that Hubbard had sex with her and with her husband.
You'll tend to see that. That's why I asked, because the people who are most homophobic are gay themselves.
I think it's often the case.
Yeah, they're hiding something from him, and that makes sense to why he's done all this kind of madness where the mind is slipped with the drugs and all the other shit. Do these people get paid? Do high-end people get paid from Scientology?
No, they give money to Scientology.
So they donate to Scientology?
Sometimes very large amounts. I mean, Leah Remini in one day gave them $1 million.
Because I watched a documentary, I think it was Louis Theroux, it done on Scientology.
Yeah, my Scientology move.
And it was interesting. There's a man in America as well who follows them around, but it's like they're robots. 20 or 30 of them going in like to a school, but it's like they try and cut them off and stuff. They're like robotic. Like you're talking major brainwashing. It's like they're not here. It's like they're programmed to walk this way. Like they're all walking the same. They're all it's so weird. And I'm thinking, is this real? But is it obviously created in America then?
Yeah.
And then when you go into these like churches of Scientology, like do people pray? Like how does it work? Are you in, do you talk? Are you in a room? Or how does it all work?
No, as I say, he talked about the religion angle. When I was going to St Hill, which is the headquarters in East Grinstead in south of London, they had a Sunday service. And I talked with the chaplain who held the service, and he said he'd never had anybody attend it. The reason they had a service was so that they could register as a religious group and get charitable tax exemption. So they have a naming ceremony. I never saw one. They have a marriage service. In 9 years, I attended one Scientology marriage. And they have a funeral service. I'd never attended a Scientology funeral service. They don't have any hymns or prayers or things of that type.
So when did you decide enough was enough? After 9 years, was that something you were thinking about for a long time? Is there anybody you can speak to involved in it, how you were thinking? Or was it kind of solo to make the decision and then try and get out? Because what is the rules and regulations of trying to get out? Is there any?
Well, you are considered an antisocial personality, a suppressive person if you leave Scientology. Scientologists are forbidden to speak to you. What happened for me was that I took the OT levels, the operating thetan levels, and after doing OT3, I went in and said, I don't think any benefit has come from this. And to my amazement, the guy who had in fact been the head of Scientology's auditing in the UK, he said to me, a lot of people find that. I'm like, we've always been told this was fantastic and, you need to do OT4. So I did OT4. I borrowed money and did OT4. And I went in and I said, I'm sorry, no, this is not having... And I thought, I'm going to be in trouble this time. And he said, yeah, a lot of people find that. You need OT5. So I then did OT5. And I finished that in the summer of 82. And I really didn't have very much more to do with them after that. And I started to think that maybe the earlier stuff was useful, but that these OT levels were, I thought it was crazy. When I opened the pack and read it, I just thought it was insane. But, you've been doing it for 7 years. You kind of think, I'll check it. I'll see what happens. And eventually, for me, after I'd left the mother cult, which happened in October 1983, I actually went and had my OT5 checked by independent Scientologists who'd been running it for Scientology at St. Hill, so they were fully trained in the thing. And I came to the conclusion during 3 days of sessions that I'd never had a body thetan. This was complete nonsense, that I'd constructed it in my imagination because it was coming from Ron Hubbard. Some of you said before that I think it's very relevant that we project our hero values into other people. So when somebody looks at Tom Cruise, they're looking at their own idea of an ideal human being. And they're saying, oh, look, he's fantastic. It's projection. Mm-hmm. And the reality, having spoken with significant religious figures and all sorts of people over the years, I haven't met anybody who knows what's going on. I've met a lot of people who are really good at pretending they know what's going on, but that's it.
So how did you get out then?
In September 83, I wrote a set of questions with references to Hubbard work and said, I don't like what's going on here. I was reported to the ethics section of Scientology for doing this. And
is this in America or England?
This was in the UK. I did all of my Scientology here in the UK. A friend of mine, I'd been told early in sort of about February 83, the friend of mine, a guy who'd worked for me, who'd been a very high-ranking, famous Scientologist, I was told that he'd been declared suppressive. And so I said, well, where's his trial? Where are the allegations against him? Where is the conviction? These things are meant to happen in Scientology. And they said, oh, no, he's just on a list. And at that point, I'm sort of, this is a sham. And I spent 6 months, you had to write to people in a chain. So the Continental Justice Chief, the International Justice Chief, Hubbard was still alive. You were encouraged to write letters to Hubbard. And so I wrote a letter that basically said, look, I know that Ron Hubbard doesn't get these letters, this much I'm wise to, but this is the last authority, the highest authority. So, and all I got back was, well, he's got to sort it out for himself. We're not willing to do anything. And so my faith had gone in Scientology itself, what the operating thetan levels were. It had gone in the organization, that it was becoming tough and ruthless. Those were the two words that we used. And tough, yeah, that needs to happen sometimes. Ruthless, without mercy. I don't think that ever needs to happen. I think we always need to have compassion for other people. So that bothered me. There was a lot of bullying. We started hearing about physical violence, which Louis Theroux takes up in his thing. I just came to that point where I wanted to take Scientology out of the organization, give it to people at an acceptable price. As I say, it was £120 an hour by then, which in today's money would probably be like 200 quid an hour or something. I wanted to make it available to people so it would change the world. I still believed, I just didn't believe in the organization, and I didn't believe in the upper level teachings. Then, as I say, I found myself at the middle of the independent Scientology movement, quite by accident. There was a public meeting on the 18th of October 1983, and this mad guy called Captain Bill Robertson, who'd worked very closely with Hubbard, been thrown out the year before, he'd come along and was giving a talk. And 3 days before this talk, this guy woke me up, stood by my bedside, saluted me, which nobody had ever done before, and asked me if I'd host this meeting because he'd heard I was disaffected. And because he called me sir, I thought, well, why not? So I hosted this meeting with no information about what was going to happen, and about 60 people. It was the first ever public meeting of disenchanted Scientologists in the UK. And about 60 people turned up, and this is when it started. At the door, there were two guys taking our names. And the next day, somebody who'd come to the meeting was declared suppressive. So the harassment began. And that encouraged me to go further. But I still really believed in Scientology. That's why I'd left. I'd left because I wanted people to have access to it. And I thought that something malign had taken it over. It had become negative and bullying. And I didn't want any part of that. Then within a few months, I became disenchanted about Hubbard himself. And while many people will take on board that he frequently lied, he frequently contradicted himself. So for example, when he claimed to have been crippled and blinded in World War II, he also claimed in a professional auditor's bulletin called Communication and Isness that he'd been in Hollywood on July the 25th, 1945. So the end of the war was the 14th of August. So how is he crippled and blinded? And he said he beat up 3 petty officers. So then there was an interview he gave in November 1950's Look magazine where he lists his war wounds. He had ulcers, conjunctivitis, he'd fallen down a ladder. His eyes had suffered from the blast of a gun, and he had something wrong with his feet. Those are the 5 conditions of war wounds. He'd later say that he'd been hit by a machine gun bullet, which is a pretty unlikely thing to survive, and had rowed from the wreck of the Edsall, the first American ship sunk outside of Pearl Harbor, on its way to Australia, that he'd rowed from there to Australia. It's 800 miles. He'd been hit by a machine gun bullet and rowed 800 miles. I mean, wow, what an incredible man. The reality from his Navy files is he wasn't on the Edsall. He wasn't hit by a machine gun bullet. He was in Australia working as what's called an intelligence officer, which has led to much confusion. He was he was censoring sailors' letters.
So is he just a con man then?
Yes.
Who's found out the art of manipulation?
Yes.
Is that all it comes down to?
It does, but what the system he developed is the most elaborate system of thought reform ever devised. I've studied the Chinese system in depth. I've studied the MK Ultra systems in some depth, and they don't work. If you take somebody out of the environment after they've been through the Chinese senile brainwashing program, it will evaporate gradually for most people. For 90% of people, if they're not in an environment where it's constantly being reinforced, it won't happen. China is an environment where it is constantly.
Is there a cut-off point, though, for how much time they can? You know what I'm saying? So if they were to do it for 6 months, then it may be ingrained into their subconscious or their conscience. Is there a time period if something was repeated over and over that you wouldn't get out? Or is, like you say, it always evaporates? Is that...
It's very dependent on the individual. But Robert J. Lifton, when he studied people who've been through the Chinese Communist program, found, I think it works out that 1 person in 25, it's going to stick forever. But, therefore, 96% of people, it will take time. But it very much depends on the individual. The idea in MK Ultra to create the Manchurian Candidate, a programmable zombie, which they failed to do completely, as far as we know. But whereas in Scientology, it's self-reinforcing. After people leave, you can talk to them, and I do, 25 years later, and it's still going on. They still see the world through the lens of Scientology, through the ideas of L. Ron Hubbard. It's not difficult to undo. I can usually undo it in a single conversation with people to give them the way of taking it apart, which is about not believing in Hubbard, in realizing that he made things up.
Can you do that with people who battle with addictions or that as well, where you just switch that light, or is that more complex? That
is more complex. I think, and it's not something that I've sought to treat in people, that a gambling, a drug addiction like that, there are good ways of dealing with that.
Because I used to be a gambler.
Yeah.
Every day, every night. some days not sleep for 2-3 days, really bad. But I changed it. I changed the way I thought. I changed the way I feel about it. It doesn't have that power, but I still fucking think about it.
Of course.
So I do. I just don't act on it, which is so important.
There's a therapy system in the US where this guy, all he did was he put a camera on people while they were gambling, and then got them to watch the recordings of themselves. And most people are really shocked to see, how they've gone into this kind of state. And that has helped a lot of people.
Everything changes you. You don't, if you've seen yourself doing majority of things in life, you would stop. Same as when people, if you showed them when they were drunk or high on drugs, you would go, shit, is that me? Because the perception up here of ourselves is totally different.
Exactly.
The way we are. So it is important if people could really see their true selves and go, well, this is really you. Do you really want to be that person? Do you really lead by example? Does this make you a good father? Or there's just so many different things, but it is mad how the mind can gravitate towards something and have a strong belief about it. Was there many risks leaving Scientology? Is it life or death, or is that a bit far-fetched?
It usually not, but people can be really devastated. There were Conway and Siegelman who studied Jonestown, and they wrote a book called Snapping, which was very popular. And they interviewed 33 Scientologists and various Krishnas, Moonies, people from the Way International. And they said, if you come out of the Krishnas or the Moonies 3 to 6 months later, you'll be okay again. Scientology, we think probably 12 and a half years. I wrote to them in 2013 and said, well, obviously, you talk with 33 people. It's an estimate, it's a guess. Don't you think it'd be more correct to say that unaided, most people will never recover from Scientology? And they came back and said, yes, we think that's what we think now. So it's a way of making a Manchurian candidate. It's a way of making somebody act against themselves. At the moment, if you go to the internet, there are hundreds of channels dealing with Scientology now. There are so many ex-Scientologists, and many of them are talking about the damage they suffered and continue to suffer. And it can create a kind of victimhood where they're celebrities through being victims. And so that perpetuates the need to be a victim. And there's very little out there that's actually helping people to deal with the experience. I have a channel, but it got 10,000 subscribers or what have you. It's really not significant.
What is your channel for people to watch and subscribe?
Jon Atack, Family and Friends. Yeah. I did a video with Lad Bible down in London, their honesty box, and that's had 1.2 million views to my amazement.
1.4.
1.4, okay.
I watched it last night.
Okay. I'm obviously not watching closely enough.
No.
But which is great. It means that people are getting a message about Scientology, but it won't be the ex-Scientologists who are watching that. It won't be the people who've suffered harm from Scientology. And, that there is a way out of this thing, that, and it doesn't need to take a lifetime. It's especially difficult for people who are born into it because they have nothing to compare it with. And sometimes they'll get a resentment about people who were recruited into it because they'll say, well, you chose to do it. Well, no. Nobody chooses to join a group that's going to take all their money, destroy their relationships, and enslave them. That's not a choice. It's because you're lied to. It's because you're deceived. And then processes are used to make you feel euphoric, to make you feel high, in their terms, where you have very good indicators. And it leads to people dissociating from the important things in life. As you say, the way you get over gambling or drug addiction is you say, am I looking after my kids properly? Am I a good parent? Reality comes through and you say, well, I have to mend my ways because there are other people who are important. Scientology, as with any addiction, is narcissistic. You just focused on yourself. You just focused on getting the next hit instead of having experience in the world. You asked me early on, was I happy during that time? And I said no, because I was struggling to try and find something. So there was, of course, momentary happiness. But in the last 10 or 15 years, I have become comfortable with life. You know, I don't have anything to sell. I don't have any guru strategy, but I'm comfortable to be alive. And that may just be because I stopped searching. And I read so much. You know, one of the books I published is a translation of the Tao Te Ching, the Chinese Lao Tzu's, which I met when I was 17 and have stayed and read. I've read 60 translations of it. I translated it character by character, and I've read about 50 commentaries on it. Did it make me wise? No. It gave me some useful information about how to deal with life. And looking at that and say Jiangsu, but I studied Buddhism pretty thoroughly. I read all of the sutras, the Digha Nikaya, not just the 4 that most people read. I've read loads of Sufi literature, Christian mysticism, all sorts of things, and they're all fascinating, and they're all insights into creating a metaphor in which to live. But I don't want a metaphor. I want the truth. Whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, I want the truth. And stripping away those metaphors, it seems to me we don't know any purpose in the universe. I can't conceive that there's a purpose in the universe. And if I could, it would be within the context of human meaning. And human meaning, given the scale of the universe, is such a tiny little thing. So I don't believe in God. I don't disbelieve in God. It doesn't bother me whether there is or isn't a God, because God would be, with 100 billion galaxies, God would be so much more immense than anything my tiny mind can understand. So I'm satisfied to be who I am. In Scientology, I was never satisfied. It was always, you've got to do the next thing. You've got to find the money. You've got to, get to the next level. And eventually what you're being taught is the imagination of a guy who was taking a lot of drugs and was into Satanism.
Yeah.
It's like,
was he into Satanism?
He was trying to incarnate the Antichrist. The book I've just written started because the highest level of Scientology, Operating Thetan level 8, which he very sensibly didn't release while he was alive. So in 1988, 2 years after his death, this fantastic level is released. And it starts with a bulletin, which after a week was withdrawn. Now, I've absolutely confirmed this bulletin was on it. I've got it. And in it, he says that he's with Lucifer and the Antichrist, that the mission of Scientology is to stop the second coming of Christ. That's the whole purpose of Scientology. Now, a few Scientologists saw that when they paid their $250,000 or what have you to take this level aboard their cruise ship, the Free Winds. And several of them were so distressed by this, even though they were committed members, they left and they made it public. So it was withdrawn. But in there, you have the whole idea of Scientology. Yes, he was a Crowleyite. He was somebody who believed that Jehovah and Christ were bad and that the devil under whatever guise was good. And that was the secret. So as I said early on, where Crowley was truthful about being an evil bastard, Ron Hubbard just pulled the wool over people's eyes. And
Was he ever in contact with LaVey? Is it LaVey? The Satanist?
Anton LaVey. Not as far as I know.
Because his last words were, I think before he took his last breath, is, "Oh no, what have I done?" And his wife, they say Taylor Swift is her daughter, or her granddaughter, because they're like twins. The Taylor Swift is one of the biggest name, if not the biggest name on the planet at the moment. Yep. But they say there's a connection. But again, it's a form of manipulation. Idolize these people, do as these people say, follow as they do. So these people are put on pedestals where people can follow. And a lot of people might think I'm crazy, but look at the photos of LaVey's wife, the Satanist. He started the Satanist church. And look at the photos of Taylor Swift. They're identical. Identical. We'll know all about the overseeing eye and covering the eye and the 666 and the hand gestures. It's not necessarily the celebrities, they're just getting told to do that by the people who are promoting their own message. It's like Scientology, promote this, do this, speak highly of it. The Illuminati side of things have all got their own messages and all signs, but we kind of know majority of them now. But it's interesting to see how people kind of put it together.
I've been, because of the book I've just written, which is called If Scientology Ruled the World, Nazi Occultists, Sex Magic, Space Aliens, and the Second Coming. I couldn't get golf and cats and recipes in there, but the rest of the clickbait's all there. But it is actually about all of those things. And tracing back ideas that are now, we talk about the Illuminati. The Bavarian Illuminati was a very short-lived group and doesn't seem to have been that dangerous, but it was revived. The extent to which Masons, the Rosicrucians, that any of what they teach is true. I did a deep dive into Madame Blavatsky, who's the origin. She studied, somebody said of her that she was the most learned, if not the wisest woman of the 19th century. She was an incredible human being. I don't think she's a Ron Hubbard type. I think she was sincere. I think she was also crazy. But she spoke like 9 languages. She studied with Masons, with Sufis, with Rosicrucians, with fakirs in India. She really did absorb all of this stuff. Hubbard read a few Crowley books and the National Geographic and the boy's own book of something or other, put that together with some science fantasy ideas. She was really smart. She'd been through all of this stuff. But there's a serious problem. And the serious problem, she influenced Carl Gustav Jung tremendously. So Jungian psychology comes out of Madame Blavatsky. Anthroposophy, currently the Dutch government has anthroposophists in it. The Silicon Valley people won't let their kids have devices and send them to Waldorf schools. These are anthroposophy things. And it is some crazy stuff that they believe. But when you get down to it, their confirmation is not through scientific evidence. It's not through saying, we did a study and we tried this out on 1,000 people. We had a control group. It was replicated, all of this. No. It's because it feels right to them. And so they will say, well, I saw it personally in my mind. And that's the evidence. And Hubbard, so where Hubbard, there's a recording of him called The Battle of the Universes, which is not much known. And he goes into trance. You can hear him going into this. He's now talking in a strange voice in the way that channel mediums tend to. And he's talking about there being 80 different universes overlapped, and some of them are physical and some of them are spiritual, and we're being invaded by these targs which are taking over our bodies and all of this stuff. And you're going, he's whacked. He's taken some speed and he's gone. There's no confirming this. So, for example, Scientologists all believe in past lives, in reincarnation. I've talked to over 1,000 Scientologists, people who've been involved over the years. I have never yet heard a credible story about a past life. So you say to somebody, they say to you, I was at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. You say, which side were you on? You say, well, I was on the French side. You say, and so what happened? They say, well, all these longbows and all of, 2/3 of the French nobility died. And then you say, tell me something in medieval French, because that was the language you spoke then, right? Tell me just one phrase from 1415 in French. They can't do it. I've had a friend of mine, actually, because he believed this, he mapped a town where he was sure he'd had a past life. His wife didn't believe, and eventually he took her there, and they found that nothing was correct. It was completely. And it'd be easy enough to demonstrate, because if somebody could speak the French of 1415, it'd be rather obvious. So we want to believe these things.
Yeah, you convince yourself. A liar can convince himself of telling the truth. What about déjà vu?
I think there's certainly a mechanism with, the brain is composite. That, there's not me sitting and directing the brain. It's not like the numbskulls.
Never switches off.
And you've got 200 brain regions. So the idea that one part of the brain can become aware of something before another part of the brain gives you one explanation of déjà vu. Oh, this feels so... So there's that thing. And there's also, of course, that you may well have had a very similar experience. If somebody can give me prophecy, so they'll say, this is what will happen on this day. Now, when you look at prophetic works, say like the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, they're actually written centuries after the time they claim to have been written in, and the prophecies are of things that have already happened. If you get in, say, the Mayan calendar, the world ended in 2012. Nostradamus, Goebbels used Nostradamus. The Nazi propaganda machine used Nostradamus to say it proves that we are going to win World War II. Doesn't seem to have been right. And with so many of these things, they're faked. They're put together to convince us. It should be easy enough for somebody to say, these events will happen. I've written it down. I've posted it to my lawyer. And then they happen. Cases that even make any claim of that are very rare, very rare. And when you investigate them, there's usually a link in the chain that isn't right. There's something about them, and I have looked into lots of claims of reincarnation.
Especially if they're intoxicating themselves, especially if drugs are involved, pharmaceutical drugs.
Yeah.
Now, what I'm getting through the people who I've interviewed through the years is people are just recycling the same shite.
Yeah.
That's all we're hearing now. It's just, even the conspiracies, and nobody's giving me answers. They're repeating the same things that I'd spoke to someone 20 years ago. I never spoke to them, but I've seen their videos and the stuff that they're promoting. I actually listened to a book, the audio book. It was called Outwitting the Devil. Napoleon Hill. Unbelievable.
Oh, Napoleon Hill.
Unbelievable. Like, he was having a conversation with the devil. Now, this was in the 30s or 40s. Yeah. They tried to ban this book, but everything he says, how the devil's not real. The devil's, whether it's a negative force or whatever, the conversation is unbelievable. It's so ahead of its time, nearly 100 years ago. And yeah, very powerful. I tried to read the book. My mind doesn't really register when I read. I struggle, go back and forth. When I listen, it takes me places and I can register it more. So yeah, for anybody watching or listening, Outwitting the Devil, just talks about how he's controlled through religion and the foods and the alcohol and the drugs and all the other stuff. And powerful book. But again, I'm just believing in it. It could all be bullshit as well, you know. Other people can read that. Me and you can read a chapter and we could take two totally different things and perceptions out of that chapter. Going back to Scientology again.
Well, let me just say something about Napoleon Hill. If you go onto YouTube, you can find TV programs that Napoleon Hill made in the 1950s, the early 1950s, and that will show you what sort of man you were listening to. And I'll leave it at that. I recommend watching his videos. He's basically a power of positive thinking guy who's selling methods that come from Andrew Carnegie. And while Carnegie was absolutely one of the most successful businessmen ever, he was also one of the most evil people who ever lived.
Scottish.
Well, I wasn't going to say anything about that.
Scottish.
You know, the greatest civilian disaster before 9/11 in the US was the Homestead disaster, where he decided to widen a road so that his carriage could go along it, pierced a reservoir, and 2,000 people died. So Carnegie, as a role model, is rather like Tom Cruise as a role model. You know, let me see that you've got this thing. Hill studied with him and put forth business methods from that.
Well, Think and Grow Rich is one of the most sold books in the world.
Yeah, and Power of Positive Thinking. Norman Vincent Peale, who of course was Donald Trump's guru, that he went to church at the Peale Church every week.
Do you think these people are all connected, all related in some sort of way? Now, I don't know about life and who has the patterns to it, but I believe someone has the transcripts. I believe someone has the blueprint how to be successful. I believe all these families are kind of connected where they pass it down, the rules and the techniques, how to stay successful, how to stay beyond. Because they talk about the family tree, and if someone's successful in the family, like it's a big percentage of the next generation not to be successful. But these families in the banking system and other kind of big families, they've been at the top of their game for 500 years, 1,000 years, where they're constantly competing against the bigwigs. It's like all one big circle. Do you think there's a blueprint for how these people stay in power instead of the other people? I wouldn't say we're the peasants, but we're kind of down at the lower vibration, where they're constantly at the peak of wealth. Wealth isn't the answer. There's people who's out there who I know has got nothing that are happier than the people out there I've interviewed get billions. So it's just but these people always seem to stay on top. Their families always seem to stay wealthy. Do you believe there's techniques to that, or is it just luck?
I think that, because I'm writing about Aryan race theory, I've also been writing about eugenics. And the arguments of eugenics are fundamentally that breeding is the thing, that you have blue blood. We'll never know. It's probably Anton LaVey's ghost.
Yeah, try to shut us down.
So one of the responses to eugenics was a guy who did believe in it, and he did a study of 588 famous people to see how successful their parents were, their children were, and he found that actually when you did a big enough number, that it doesn't continue. So if you look at it, if you've accumulated that much money, where are the Vanderbilts now? They were the richest people in the world in the Gilded Age in the 1870s, 80s, 90s. They managed to fritter away most of that money. Then you have somebody like, say, Henry Ford and the Ford Foundation. You have the Rockefeller Foundation. I think that what's continued is they've got so much money. And I personally do believe that anybody that's got $1 billion is an evil person. I think anybody that's accumulated that much, enough to keep themselves for 100 lifetimes and not giving it away, they have too much power. They shouldn't have that much power. And certainly when we get up to Bill Gates, who's claiming to have spent 100 billion, in the next 20 years, he's going to give the other 200 billion away. And you're going, if you're a good person, give it away now. Change the world now. So if you've accumulated that much, it's like being a dinosaur. You may have a very small brain, but you've got a very big body and things keep functioning. So the dynasties do fade. Where are the Medici now? Where are the Fuggers? Those are the two families that created the Italian Renaissance or funded it. They're gone. And so I think there's a thing of, and when you look to the aristocracy, the British aristocracy, they have to keep marrying rich people because they can't afford. So I don't think there's any blueprint. I don't think there's any pattern that's being passed on. I think there are con artists who are able to gather far too much money and then have far too much influence on the rest of the world. Sometimes those families, Rockefellers, Fords, Rothschilds, do continue. Because if you're born with an income of, $300 million a year, you can probably keep going for a little while and you will have an influence. That influence will usually be negative because if you're willing to have that much power in the world, you aren't a good person.
Money is influence, and it's these people who fund both sides of wars. It's these people who want the world in a low vibration for complete control, and the money does control. If you're working a 9 to 5, listen, if you're paying for your family and doing that, you are a winner, you are a king or a queen if you're providing for your family. But these people just want you in the system from the like I say, I always say it, but for the mid-20s or the 30s, I think it was John Rockefeller who started the schooling system, where he then got women rights to vote, and before you know it, instead of men paying taxes, women are working, they're then paying taxes. So what happens now? The man and women are working. Where does your children go? In the system. And like you say, it's a form of manipulation, it's a form of control. Believe this way, there's world wars, memorization. You're not using your creativity, your individuality. It's not until you'll see now that some of the most successful people on this planet come from not much schooling education, because they can think for themselves.
They're often dyslexic as well. It's very interesting that people who couldn't be brainwashed into the system can sometimes see things that I think our university education has become so blinkered. I dropped out when I was 17. I had a year in art, 2 years in art college later, but academically, I dropped out. And when I deal with a lot of academics, and it's interesting to find that they've been schooled to believe certain things. So there are a lot of pro-cult apologists, a lot of professors who've written things about, there's nothing wrong with cults. Even Adam Curtis, who's made so many fascinating documentaries, The Century of the Self, The Power of Nightmares. In 2012, he did a thing that's on YouTube called Memory Marathon, where he basically says there is no cult has ever damaged anybody. The only damage that's ever been done to them is by people being kidnapped and deprogrammed. And I'm kind of going, Well, I can introduce you to hundreds of people who've been damaged, who were never kidnapped, were never deprogrammed, that, awful things happened to them. How can you, as a rational human being, believe that no group has ever hurt anybody? There are thousands of cults out there. The Jonestown massacre didn't happen, or what are we talking about? But there are academics who follow this line. Brian Wilson, not the beach boy who died yesterday, but the academic at Oxford, who was head of sociology there, he said, you can't trust anything that an ex-member of a group says. And you're going, so we have no rights anymore. What are you talking about? What a ridiculous thing to say. You can believe what people who are enchanted by a system say, but you must never believe what people are disenchanted by. What kind of perception of reality is that? If somebody leaves the Nazis and says, oh, they were killing Jews, you kind of go, oh, well, you can't believe them because he's an apostate. He's not a Nazi anymore. It's a ridiculous idea, but it's repeated by academics. You can't trust the ex-members. It's like, well, okay, in my book, Blue Sky, I give 1,100 reference notes. Go and check them. Believe me, you don't have to. So all sorts of biases which come from the system. And remarkably, given that cult groups, destructive cult groups, are out there, there are hundreds of thousands of former members, no academic study is being done. There should be hundreds of PhDs investigating this. It's not happening because the education system has become ever more narrow and focused on, I think, on the wrong issues, not on opening people's minds so they can think better, but on closing their minds so they'll agree better.
Yeah, they want to comply. They don't want free thinkers. They want people to comply. They want workers. They want machines to work for them and create their corporation. Yeah. And again, it's just another... Listen, it's good to read and write and communicate, but the system is flawed. The system is backwards where it's not really enhancing human beings. If anything, it's destroying us. Just to go back to the Scientology thing, was there a dress code? Like, what sort of jobs did people have? Did everybody have certain jobs to do? And because I think I read or watched in one of your videos, they used to wear like sailors' outfits or something. How accurate is that?
That's exactly right. The Sea Organization, of whom there are currently about 4,000 members, so about a fifth of all the people in Scientology, they wear sailor suits. They're in fact Coast Guard, US Coast Guard uniforms. They'll even wear campaign ribbons, which is against the law here and in the US, but nobody's ever prosecuted them for it because it's called something valor, stolen valor. That it's against the law, like Freud, to wear these things. Yeah, because they're basically combat ribbons. Which are rewarded to them for having, gone to the toilet successfully or whatever it is they've achieved. But it's certainly got nothing to do with having faced fire and had to fight in had combat.
What's the method behind that?
I think there's Hubbard basically wanted to create his own paramilitary force, and he does. There are issues when he was starting it in 1967. It's originally called the Sea Project. He starts talking about them all being trained in martial arts and them having weapons training and this kind of thing. And that fell by the wayside. But they dress up in Coast Guard uniforms, with the peaked caps and the whole thing. You can see photos of them all in their sailor suits. Very bizarre, and it's because I think of his dreadful, dire career in the Navy. He was subjected to so many admonitions for bad behaviour. I've got his Navy file. It's 800 pages of excruciating material. So he does things like he spent 55 hours. He went on a shakedown cruise and off the coast of Oregon. He had a 55-hour battle, and he drew in blimps, rigid balloons. He drew in other patrol craft and got them into this battle. And it was adjudged that what he was attacking was actually a magnetic deposit. Scientology would later... I was asked once at dinner what the most ludicrous thing I'd heard about Scientology that year was. And I said, well, it's that they spent $250,000 to look at the seabed to try and find the remains of the Japanese submarines off Cape Lookout. And it just so happened, very small gathering, this woman sat at the table and she lowered her head and she said, 400,000. What? She said, I ran the mission. $400,000 to try and find it. Whereas, in fact, all you have to do is look at the Japanese Navy's losses. They lost no submarines off the California, Oregon coast. There you go. And it was the first thing the Allies checked at the end of the war. Where are the submarines? Because that's what they'll be using to escape in. So every German submarine, every Japanese submarine was logged. None of them were lost there. From there, he went down the coast and he shelled a Mexican island, which was thankfully uninhabited, Los Coronados Islands, which nearly caused an incident with Mexicans, that a US vessel, and he's told you'll have no command after that. Scientology then makes up this story that he was working under deep cover as an intelligence officer during World War II, and this is a sheep-dipped file. This is a made-up file. And you're going, well, if you were going to make up a file about somebody, you wouldn't fill it with admonitions from admirals saying what a dreadful... So I think because he was such a failure at that creating the Sea Organization and calling himself the Commodore was a way of, almost fulfilling his childhood fantasy of having his own little navy.
Reliving his youth kind of thing. His failed accomplishments he's trying to relive. How hard has it been trying to, when you left Scientology and speaking out against it? Surely you must have been a threat. There must have been some sort of danger with the high people these people know. You see videos and other certain things that people's life are really in danger by speaking out against that.
Oh, yeah.
I'd imagine people speak out against it. It's not as extreme, but you've went full throttle. You've exposed everything. You've interviewed people about it. Yeah. How much was your life in danger through that?
I'm not sure if my life was in danger, but I was followed by people with guns when I was in the US. I was followed by private detectives here. Private detectives tried to con me into doing, antisocial, negative, criminal things. One of their detectives tried to set me up with the drug squad. Thankfully, I had a good connection with the police at the time, so we didn't get the raid that they tried to set up. I was told in 1993, so I'd been out for nearly 10 years, and the head of their intelligence, what is called the Office of Special Affairs Investigation, she, for 18 months, had been running harassment against me, and I wasn't stopping. So she decided she'd come and talk to me herself. And we talked for 3 hours, and she asked if she could come back the next day. I said yes. When she came back the next day, I confronted her. I said, I know that you're actually the head of investigation unit, and that I know what you're doing. And she broke down. And she told me that they had spent £2 million harassing me during that 9.5-year period, that they had sent out 9 what they call missions from their headquarters in California to destroy me, to take my life apart. She was running 5 agents against me, 4 of whom were in my close circle. One of them was actually my driver. And he'd set up a camera in a room across the street from my house, which ran 24 hours a day, to notice anybody that came to my house. So, I was constantly harassed. My house was broken into twice. Nothing was taken. It was just made clear that they could get in. One day I woke up to find my next door neighbor opening my front door to let somebody in. And this guy had convinced him that, it's like, and he ran, he hightailed it. They distributed pamphlets. They reported me to every authority possible, to, anything, to basically put as much pressure on you so that you'll stop. The guy before me, who I didn't find out about for a while, so a guy called Neil Duddy, and he was an Anglican priest, and he took them on. And that ended up with the News of the World, scurrilous rag talking about the control of media by Murdoch and Maxwell and the likes, ran a centerfold spread saying that Neil Duddy was running orgies for 15-year-old boys with drugs in his vicarage. It was completely unfounded. But Neil Duddy went on holiday and walked off the side of a mountain. The pressure was such. So the idea is I ended up, I think I was sued in New York. I don't know how much. I think it was they brought 7 cases against me here, and the year that happened, there was an investigation by Lord Chief Justice Wolfe, and at the end of it, he said it is the case in English law that he with the deepest pockets wins. And 6 months after I lost the last of my cases, the rule under which I'd lost it was changed. It was a loophole. It was a way of, basically a discovery where you give documents that they need to be relevant. If you need me to deal with that, I will.
That's okay.
So, yeah, they just use everything.
Is that how much power they have?
It was money, and the fact, there was a guy called Arnie Lerma who stood up against them, and he, when he was asked for a puff for my book, Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, he said, before the internet, before Safety in Numbers, there was Jon Atack. And that was the case for me for 12 years. I was out on my own, and they threw £2 million into trying to stop me, and they didn't manage. So, but you have to be very determined. And for me, as I said, if they'd stopped harassing me, I'd have stopped speaking out. And then I had a 17-year period where I didn't. From 1996 to 2012, when I went on BBC's Big Questions and talked about it again. I didn't have anything to do with it. I didn't read about it, didn't write about it, because I realised that nobody was going to support me, that, there was no money in doing it. I'd lost a 5-bedroom house, which is now worth about £600,000. I was crushed at law because I couldn't afford the lawyers. And, they managed to use a libel action against me. So yeah, they're hardcore. Then what happened was, in the 90s, the World Wide Web occurred, and people could post anonymously. And one of the first message boards, Out Religion Scientology, there are hundreds of people suddenly against them. And then there were high-level defectors during the period that I'd left. Leah Remini, Mike Rinder was very important. Marty Rathbun, who was in the Louis Theroux thing. Rinder and Rathbun had worked directly for David Miscavige, the leader of Scientology. They ran the harassment department, and then they left. So there were people, it was more important to shut up than me. And now, where it was me, there were a few other people, Jerry Armstrong, Lawrence Wallerstein, Bob Penny, significantly. Vaughan and Stacey Young. There were just a few of us. Now there are thousands of people protesting this group, and so they still libel me. They still publish things on their websites about me, but being watched all the time and having, people would come to me and with their complaints against Scientology and ask my advice. And then there was one woman, her husband had got multiple sclerosis. He was Jerry Rafferty's producer. Didn't produce the famous singles, but he produced a couple of albums, Jerry Rafferty and other people. Then he got MS. And she'd phoned me up, and after about a year, she confessed to one of our mutual friends who'd just left Scientology that she'd been asking me questions that were given to her. She'd been recording all the answers. So that was quite typical. It meant that I had to be honest and honourable in everything I said, because it would be used against me otherwise. So, which was actually quite a good thing, to have to dot every I and cross every T when I was giving information.
What sort of books I know you've written? Is it 9 books?
I've probably written more than that. I think there are 8 in print at the moment.
Because you're very well educated, like a historian, you know your stuff. Like, what do you think life is, John, in your own perception?
I have no idea. I think philosophically, I'd point to the Jiangsu, the Chinese philosopher, who fundamentally said, I don't know where I was before I was born. I don't know where I'll be after I die. I'm going to get on with it. And it's a sort of positive stoicism, Epicurean stoicism, where I seek to do the best I can, live the best life I can. I'm really lucky. I've got 4 kids. I've got 2 grandchildren. I get on with all of them. There have been times.
Yeah, they're pains in the asses. Let's be honest.
Yeah, but let's not do it on camera. I'm theoretically retired. I've been retired for 4 years. I haven't had a moment's peace because I'm still working on these things. And I enjoy doing things like this. I enjoy talking about it, and hopefully helping some people to not become involved, and helping some people who've been involved to realize that they can recover from what's happened to them. Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky is a fairly thorough history of Scientology and Hubbard. I don't get into my complaints about its technology there so that people who've been involved can read it without getting upset. That's just come out as an audiobook, so you might like to have a go at that. We use this new system that Kindle are using where you get a robot to read it. Mm-hmm. And my poor assistant, it probably took her longer to listen to it and check it than it would have done to read it out. I wrote a short book called Scientology, the Cult of Greed, which produces some of their documents. So you see what Hubbard wrote and how he wrote it, and shows the worst things about it. The hard selling, for example. I mean, these people are really, but it's absolutely straightforward that you hard sell. That this is more important than stocks, college savings, houses, cars, anything. Scientology is the most important thing. So you get, and people are usually in a hypnotic state anyway, so you just force that along. He says these things. They're part of the training, something that I didn't see when I was involved. I started to, my wife did their sales course. My then wife or the woman who has become my first wife, did their sales course. And this was the first time I'd seen this awful, awful material. I've published a couple of novels. I've got a couple more that are done and need to be published. So I wrote a novel where I imagined Jimi Hendrix appearing to somebody sort of 30 years after his death and guiding them through this situation where you've basically got a group of people who think they're reincarnations of the lost Cherokee Canasta tribe. And that led some interesting places. And during the course of that, I reconstructed Hendrix's death. And there are all sorts of nonsensical stories about it. He was basically poisoned deliberately by one of his girlfriends, Monica Danneman. And the evidence is pretty good. People have sadly used things she said as evidence, and she lied from the very beginning. She lied about what had happened. But she admitted giving him the barbiturate drugs that killed him, and she admitted that she knew they'd kill him. Game, set, and match for me.
Why do you think human beings are so easily manipulated and so easily programmed?
I think part of it is that the creatures that aren't easily manipulated are the predatory creatures. So the 2% of human beings that are psychopaths are very hard to manipulate. But for the rest of us, as you said before we started talking, we have the need to be socially accepted. We're sociable creatures. And until you get to be about 50 years old, for most people, life is confusing and dissatisfying. And I think there does come a kind of relaxation with age.
Because you look at the wars and what the media portray, even NASA, and there's question marks on some of the footage, moon landings, and yet people believe it. People buy into it if you're asking the questions, and that's understandable. But I just feel as if human beings are so soft sometimes, where they are so easily targeted to believe a certain narrative, whether that's Ukraine and Russia or Israel and Palestine. Like, there's so much war and destruction going on in the world, but the media portray it one way, people buy into it, and because it becomes a trend, it's the hot topic. But we just don't feel as if, with 8 billion people on the planet, so they say, that's debatable, I believe, but when you look at it all, well, why do we gravitate and why do we believe people like NASA and the news and the media? A lot of people are waking up, but we still follow what's on the news. Even myself will go, somebody will show me and I'll go, oh yeah, and you'll maybe look into it, but they're promoting something that they want you to deflect, I believe, for other things that's happening. But it's just, like when you look at NASA, what do you think of NASA, John? I know I'm going way off topic here, but what's your opinion on it?
I think with the moon landings that the reconstructions of the photographs are convincing. I've been through the more recent ways of showing why those angles and those reflections and those shadows, they seem pretty good. With NASA itself, it's created as something to scare the Russians. At the same time, you've got this massive overproduction of intercontinental ballistic missiles. I mean, there were 1,800 nuclear tests. It's like, what was it you didn't understand from the first one that you needed to get? 1,800 nuclear devices have been exploded on this planet. Therefore, putting uranium into our air, it's not a good thing. So I think it's partly the rule of stupid that humans have largely been ruled in chiefdoms, kingdoms, empires. And so when you look at the people that do that, any king, any monarch, any tyrant, any dictator, they're not good people. So, at school I was taught about good Queen Bess, Queen Elizabeth I. Good Queen Bess. Good Queen Bess spent more time with her chief torturer than any other official in her court. End of. The famous speech that she gave was written after the fact. It was an executable offence to have a portrait of her that was not approved, and they withdrew portraits. And of course, they made fanciful portraits. This is, there's to be a tyrant, to be an authoritarian dictator means to be evil. That has been the way for most human beings, but it's not the entire of history. There's a wonderful book by Graeber and Wengrow called The Dawn of Everything. They spent 10 years putting this book together, one of them an anthropologist, the other an archaeologist, to say, no, it doesn't have to be this way. There have been many other forms of society over the years. So if you look to what's called the Indus Valley Society in modern-day Pakistan, they had 700 years of peace. 700 years without war. 700 years without kings. 700 years, it appears, without priests. All the houses are the same. And so the fact that there have been human societies that have been successful means that they could be. Our society is mercantile capitalism. You mentioned the Fuggers and the Medici. They kind of started this thing. Once it became all right to lend money, which of course was believed to be against Christian principle, which is why the only thing the Jews were able to make money doing was lending money. Once that became okay, these families came to dominate the religion. So if you look at the Reformation and how that happened with Martin Luther at the beginning of the 16th century, there were people traveling around, and it was no longer priests who were selling indulgences. This is a forgiveness of your sins, and you paid a certain amount of money, and you wouldn't go to hell. And Luther and various other people, and he was a horrible person, let's not get into that, but they objected to the fact that the bankers were now, who'd loaned the money to the popes to build these wonderful things, where Jesus said, he who would follow me must give all that he has to the poor. It's like, okay, that's him saying it. That's not an interpretation. That's in the Gospels. And yet you've got these vastly powerful empires have been created. It's the wrong way for us to live. And one empire gives way to another. So, the one of the greatest of them all, the Tsarist Empire. Certainly the Russian Tsars were the wealthiest people in the world. I had the good fortune to see the Hermitage Museum, and it's got like 2 or 3 million pieces of material in it. They were and there are 3 palaces, one built on the back of the next. Incredibly rich. They fell. And then we got the Lenin-Stalin Empire. And now we've got the Putin Empire. So it passes on that people have too much power, they have too much influence, and they don't have the best motives. So, of course, to wind back, one of the things I've been working on for some time, and if anybody wants to give me money for it, that would be useful, is a course for kids to put into our secondary schools through personal, social, economic classes that the government mandates they have to do, but cannot mandate the content of. I've designed a course on propaganda, fake news, and advertising. And beyond that, I wrote a book called Opening Our Minds, which is about how these techniques are used throughout our society. I did a deep study of advertising, of public relations. I've been doing it all my life, looking at what the methods are, how you get somebody to buy a product or an idea or a belief system. They're the same things, and you can teach these things. And we should be teaching them to our kids. Our kids are not taught anything about communication, about relationship, about how to deal with arguments. They're really not being taught the things that you need to do.
Grow their own fruit and veg, grow their own crops.
Absolutely.
So important.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, I have so hundreds and hundreds of food plants around the house.
Even with lockdown, do you know they say human beings would start turning against each other, eating each other after 45 days because they don't know if there was a shortage of food.
Yeah.
Humans would start eating each other just through instinct.
And there was a massive boost in seed sales during that time, about 3 times what was normal. And it's carried on, I'm happy to say. But
very good.
Yeah, I grow a huge amount of, you can see my front garden is potatoes, and we'll have squashes and what have you.
The world, John, it seems in turmoil. They say there's been over 10,000 wars since the beginning of time. There possibly more, possibly less. I don't know. That's only from what I'm reading. But why so much greed? I believe the root of all evil is money. That's the way I see the world. There's no value to it. But yet we're living in different societies and everything's divide. Everything is divide anyway, because it keeps everybody in their own small little box, whether that's wealth, whether that's religion, race, whatever sex you want to be in. This, but everything is just kind of divide and arguments, and you talk about everybody in power. It's like war. Why is the people in power always wanting war? Like, what is that method? Is that to bring down the population, or is that just pure greed to run the world? Because there's too many dictators now. There's never going to be one ruler, I don't believe, because there's just so much divide. But why is there so much war? Why is there so much poverty? Why is there so much greed? Because with so many people on this planet, everybody should be on a level playing field to help each other, to love each other, to invest in each other and learn different cultures and beliefs and languages, and grow your own crops and be able to build your own house and not getting taxed and not paying parking fines or whatever. But why do you think there's just so much greed in this world, where some people just want it all and the destruction that comes with it?
Well, I think fundamentally, as the Buddha said, we're greedy. We are greedy animals, and that you can see the same thing in nature. You can see, say, the way that a California jay will collect acorns and hide them from the other jays, and they even will dig holes while the other jays are looking to con them into thinking that's where they're buried. It's a sign of intelligence in corvids, in crows, one of many. So I think there is a natural greed, part of which is if you don't have enough, then you're going to try and get enough. There's this perverse thing that is where something goes very wrong, where when you've got enough, and you've got enough for your kids, and you've got enough for your grandkids, and you still keep accumulating. If you look at the lives of Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Ford, they were evil people. They were utterly selfish people. They destroyed lives. You look at Carnegie's factories and the amount of deaths in them. There was no health and safety. So I think, firstly, I'm not a Marxist. I've never had any truck with that. But I think the basic idea that society, our society, is the haves versus the have-nots. And money only represents slavery. Money is a token that shows that you can control other people and force them to do what you want. We've moved from, the Norman feudal society where you had serfs and bondmen and all of that, through the horrors of the African slavery, in which, of course, there were lots of Scots and Irish and other people who got caught up and were put into the same situation. The numbers were lower. We right now, there are more slaves in the world today than there have ever been. There are more than 40 million, according to the United Nations. India has 13 million of them. I think there's a kind of spectrum of behavior. There are people who feel the power of love, and there are people who have the love of power. And the problem is that the people who have the love of power will tend to get power, and the people who feel the power of love will tend to surrender and allow things to go ahead. Finding that balance, it has happened. There have been sane human societies. There have been societies that didn't wage war. There are some small societies today, like the Kogi in Colombia, like the Huichol in Mexico, like the Barca Pygmy in the Congo on the edge of what's happening there, or the San in the Kalahari Desert. They don't have chieftains. They don't have bosses. They, whoever's best at doing something in the San and in the Barca, they lead that activity. The Barca are very keen on honey, and they have to climb these 80-foot trees to get it. And whoever's best at climbing is in charge of collecting the honey. But they don't come down and say, right, I'm the boss and we've got to go and kill our neighbours. The other problem is bloodlust. That once human beings have spilled blood, many of us find we like it. Luckily it's not something said, but you've talked with warriors, you've talked with people who've killed, and there's a high in having that power over another human being. It's a despicable and disgusting thing, and we don't like to talk about it, but it's real that in battle, about 50% of people will fire above the heads of the enemy. The American military claim they've got it to 80% now who will kill. But there is that natural sense of not wanting to do that. But then you've got the people that do want to do it. And we give them power. We voted, look at some of the politicians we voted in. And people are so dedicated and fanatical that if I even name one of these politicians, there'll be somebody watching this saying, how dare you say that about Boris Johnson? He's a brilliant man. And or Donald Trump, as we have at the moment. Not a fan of any of the Democrats, Biden, Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton started extraordinary rendition. He started sending people to foreign countries to be tortured. Obama was using drones. He lied about how they caught Osama bin Laden, claiming it was through Guantanamo Bay intelligence. They got nothing from Guantanamo Bay. They locked up 800 people without charging them with any crime.
Look at Bush, the weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah.
No weapons of mass destruction. Well, I think Obama, Bush and Clinton have killed more people than all leaders put together. And I think you float Tony Blair in the mix as well.
Yeah.
I think the four of them have killed and done more war than anyone. Like, all put together, those four have done more damage. I think tens of millions of people those guys have killed.
I question those numbers, but I would absolutely agree with you that Tony Blair ought to be on that list, because what brought us to the Iraq War was the peacekeeper speech in 1998 in Chicago. It wasn't that Bush talked him into something. He was trying to talk Bush into doing this thing, this stupid idea that we'll go around the world and any leader who's evil we'll get rid of. And you're going, well, what gives you the right? I think we can be pretty sure that by now Saddam Hussein would be dead and it would be over. And instead what we got was the death of how many million people as a consequence of this devastating, it's the modern way of war. The Russians do it, the Americans do it. The Americans did it in Korea. There wasn't one town left standing in North Korea. And I've no support for the Kim family, but they destroyed this place. They shot tens of thousands of refugees who were trying to escape from that regime. They had orders to do it. So this blitzkrieg, destroy everything that William Tecumseh Sherman used when he marched through Atlanta and
what do you think of Gaddafi? Because obviously they killed him. I believe he was trying to get away from the dollar, but obviously he was a dictator. A lot of people didn't like him, but what he done for his people with the free healthcare, no homelessness, the free education, like he gave people crops, and I think he was giving them farms and stuff to grow their own crops. He was funding it. Like, he'd done so much good for his people. What do you think the full story is behind that?
Well, again, Ruth Ben Gilead in Strongmen has quite a section on Gaddafi. The part about the dungeon where he kept his sex slaves is a little frightening.
What is that? Because I don't know that. So it's good to, because I only read from the certain things try to come away from the dollar, the good things that he'd done for his people. Like, obviously, if he's doing that, it's fucking nasty. And you tend to see a lot of these dictators have got a lot of darkness to them with that greed and power. What's that story then?
Well, that he had dungeons where for, I think the longest period was 8 years, he kept somebody so that he could sexually do what he wanted to them. People who are in there have been interviewed since. And it is, I think you make a vital point that this idea of good and evil, a force of good or a force of evil, no, it's not that simple. One man's meat is another man's poison. So when the first thing that Hitler did, or one of the first things when he came into power in January 1933, was winter benefits for the poor, to make sure that people didn't starve. So that's good. And you can actually turn round what happened in Czechoslovakia very easily. It's amazing how slanted history has to become. But the Sudetenland was largely occupied by German speakers who wanted to be part of Germany and who were being persecuted by the Czechs. So you can say that he was liberating them. So looking at how things are. But
who do we believe then? How can we look at the interviews and the stories? How do we gravitate towards the truth? Because everybody, this is what I'm saying, we could read a chapter and take totally different sides from it, because they talk about the gas chambers as well, when it says there wasn't 6 million Jews even in Germany at that time, where in the gas chamber doors apparently you could push open. Some people say the gas chambers, it wasn't gas chambers because of the plague, and they used to put stuff down to like wash them off. Like I don't know, I'm not a historian, but these are just some of the things that pop up. But how true do you think like the gas chambers and that are, with 6 million Jews dying?
It's not 6 million German Jews, that was European Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Many of them Eastern European. The death camps were all in Poland.
So the chambers were in Poland?
Yes, Auschwitz, Treblinka, and on. There were, I think, nearly 80 concentration camps, but where they were actually, they were doing experiments in Dachau and Buchenwald, where Jews were murdered, and there's no doubt about it. The number 6 million was arrived at by as a very thorough census of European Jewish populations. It's reckoned that before World War II, and it's a 3-volume work that goes sector by sector through registers of births and deaths, and says there were about 12 million Jews in Europe at the time of World War II when it started. By the end, there were only 6 million left. So, and those people hadn't evaporated. When we look at some of the, Mr. Death, I can't remember his name offhand, but the guy who said that when he tested the brick on the lining of the gas chambers at Auschwitz, there were no cyanide residues. Well, there are a couple of reasons for that. One is Auschwitz is a rebuild. The Russians flattened it. It was then rebuilt as a monument. So you can't be sure that brick had actually been in a gas chamber. The second is that cyanide would actually degrade rapidly anyway. The third is that the guy wasn't a chemist and didn't know what he was doing. So how do you tell what's true? I think the first thing is you have to find reliable sources. And in fact, last night I've been working on a paper about a psychiatrist called Nasir Ghaemi. And the first thing I would say to people is, how well qualified is this person? Now, as I say, I don't have academic qualifications, but I have experiential qualifications. So when I co-wrote a chapter on terrorism, on lone actor terrorism for the Oxford University Press, and they call me a practitioner scholar, which is a clever way of saying completely unqualified person. But because I've had decades of working with this material, I'm aware of it. So how credible is the person? Nasir Ghaemi is a professor at Tufts College. He is at Harvard Medical School. He has not only a full qualification as a psychiatrist, but he also has a degree in history. He wrote a book in which he says that in times of crisis, the best leaders are mad people. And he gives a list of 8 mad people who he says, you see, they were the best person. Winston Churchill is among them. They were the best people to lead at this time. So one of the things he says, so the first thing is, is this person qualified? Have they done the work to be able to talk about this? And that often will be an academic qualification. It could be an experiential qualification. But it's not just somebody who says, I know this because I dreamed it up, or I've seen the lost fragments from the Ark of the Covenant, or what have you. Are they qualified? But then you've got the problem that somebody like Nasir Ghaemi, he, for example, says that Neville Chamberlain had no idea of the dangers of Hitler. And you're kind of going, no. Neville Chamberlain's diary in 1934 says, the people want peace. How are we to persuade them that we have to rearm? In 1935, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, he rearmed Britain against the whole Labour vote. They wanted all the money to go to hospitals, universities, nice things like that. It was Chamberlain who said, no, the Nazis are a threat. Churchill at that time said, we need bombers. Chamberlain said, we need fighters. If Chamberlain hadn't done that, the Battle of Britain would have been lost. You then get the lie in history about Munich, that he came away peace in our time. Well, he knew that there were only 12 high-altitude fighter aircraft in the RAF, and that if war had been declared, Britain would have fallen within weeks. So that's the second part of it. I look at the expert and say, does what the expert's saying add up? Go and look for more information. Get as close to the primary documents as you can. So I've been going through a lot of material about Himmler because of Himmler's magical beliefs. And there's an order that Himmler gave. And the order is very straightforward. He had 1.25 million troops, the Waffen-SS and the Allgemeine SS, under his command. 1.25 million when they went into Eastern Europe. And an order was given to them that they needed to kill 30 million people so that resettlement could happen for the German people, so there'd be Lebensraum, living space for the German people. The information is there. There are a lot of people who try and deflect us from it. David Irving was a very good example. But there is such thing as scientific history. So if you go to the Holocaust, of all the events in human history, the one that has the most witnesses is the Shoah or the Holocaust. There are testimonies by, I think, 180,000 people saying this is what happened. Some of them are former SS officers. If you look to the Nuremberg testimony, Huss, who was the first commandant of Auschwitz, when he's asked, did you execute 1.25 million Jews? He says, yes, I executed and exterminated 1.25 million. His deputy commander supports his argument. So somebody will say, oh, well, they were tortured, they were forced to do this. There's always some way of getting around it. So then you look to consistency between accounts. And looking at the methods that we use, they shot Jews. You have the Baba Yar massacre. There's a brilliant documentary called The Nazis, A Warning from History, where people who were there are interviewed. So there's one guy, and he's saying, well, we'd always got on with our Jewish neighbours. But when the Nazis arrived, we used to help them with their harvests. They'd help us. We went to school with them. When the Nazis arrived, we killed them. We got into that thing. And there is film of this from the time. There are photographs of pits, people being shot and fall into and pushed into these pits. The carbon monoxide trucks that were one of the uses, there are people who operated them who've given testimony. When you get the testimony of nearly 200,000 people, you're in a courtroom, the testimony of 2 people is good enough.
Yeah.
So
what do you think of things like 9/11 disasters? Obviously, you don't want to go down the whole rabbit hole, but what do you think of these disasters happening? And then the people go, yeah, they'll do maybe a media outcry at maybe 9 o'clock and they'll say, yeah, this was the Taliban or it was ISIS and we need to go and take back our power and kill these people. And the other people are going, yeah, let's do it. Is that, do you believe, a form of manipulation to then go and destroy other countries and steal their gold, their poppy fields, their oil, their money? What do you think of stuff like 9/11?
I think that firstly, the CIA were aware of it and decided not to tell the FBI. The Looming Tower by Lawrence Wright is an excellent, he won a Pulitzer Prize for it, is an excellent account of the chicanery. They knew it was going to happen, they didn't do anything. The way it was then spun, that this meant that Afghanistan needed to be invaded and Iraq needed to be invaded, I think is absolutely crazy. The reality is that there were 4 groups that were lumped together and called Al-Qaeda, meaning the base. That was a term invented in a New York courtroom. It's not what they called themselves. Two of those groups, the ones in Indonesia, Malaysia, and the ones in the Maghreb in the north of Africa, although they communicated with the other groups in Sudan and Afghanistan, were not part of a command structure, nor was Osama bin Laden in charge of any of those things at that time.
The bin Laden was at Oxford University, and I believe he was involved with the CIA.
The bin Laden family were close friends with the Bush family.
Yeah, and they owned a big, like a 6% or 7% of America. Is that correct, the bin Ladens?
Probably not that much,
rich.
But they are super billionaires.
Yeah.
And I think his conversion was genuine. I think he believed that it was time to throw non-Muslims out of the holy lands of Islam, and he was motivated by that. But the idea that, there were, less than 500 members in those four groups when 9/11 happened. Within 2 years of that, there were 35,000 members because of the response to it. So rather than, Saddam Hussein, who was an evil bastard, he had nothing to do with that. But the reason for the Iraq War, I believe, is oil-based, that he had said he was going to, they had the oil for food thing, which $20 billion had been collected for, where they weren't getting the money from the oil. He said, we're going to use euros instead of dollars. And he was trying to persuade all of the OPEC, the oil-producing, exporting countries, the Arab countries, to switch to using euros instead of dollars. That would have had a phenomenal effect on the American economy. So you've got that. You've got the idea of controlling the oil supply. Saddam Hussein was a dreadful, evil man. He would probably have kept killing several thousand people a year until he died. But millions have died as a consequence of what happened, and it's destabilized the Middle East because he was what held it together, because he wasn't really a believer in Islam. The Ba'ath Party was supposedly Sunni. What's happened in Iraq is the Sunnis, who make up 40% of the population, have no power. The Shiites, who are oppressed by him, have power. And of course, the Republican Guard were just let go. So people were surprised about how was it that ISIL, Daesh managed to take so much of Syria and Iraq. It's because they're the Republican Guard. It's because they're a fully trained army. So the stupidity, one of the second in command of the team that went in to reconstruct Iraq, who was a former ambassador, she said, we were given the rough guide to Baghdad and the German constitution up from the Second World War. That was all we were given. And from there, we were going to reconstruct a country. It was asinine.
What do you think the earth is? I know people say it's round, it's flat. Is it an fundament? How do you say that?
Fundament.
A fundament. It's like in a globe. Like with your research, and I don't know if you've researched it, but with kind of knowledge, like what do you think it is under this roof? Do you think there's a sky? Do you think there's outer space? I just want your opinion on it, because I genuinely don't know. I see all these things in different videos and read certain things, and I think I just don't know. I'm not asked, if I'm honest, I'm not asked if the moon landings are real or fake. I'm not asked if the world's flat or round, but my only question is, why would they lie about it? Because I've interviewed flat earthers and they say beyond Antarctica there's other life forces. Whether that's true, again, I don't know. I believe they signed an agreement with everyone around the world to say no one can enter it in the 20s or the 30s. But what do you think it all is? What do you think we're under?
It's not a flat Earth. All you need to do is look at airplane timetables. And if you've flown around the world, then if the world was flat, the times of the flights and the time zones can't work. And everybody, every pilot, and that's tens of thousands of pilots, would have to be in on the conspiracy. So when you fly from here to Los Angeles, from London to Los Angeles, you fly the polar route. So you fly across the pole. It will take you 11 hours. If you look at the timetables and you fit it together, no, the Earth's round. Plain and simple. You can go beyond that. I have no reason to think otherwise, because you look for the Occam's razor, you look for the simplest solution. And the flat Earth demands just incredible complexity. If you look at how long it should take to fly from Argentina to Australia or what have you, it doesn't work if it's flat. It does work as a globe. So
Yeah, like I say, I don't know. I'm not even asked, but I just think it's always in a question that pops up. Have you done any research on Antarctica?
not directly. There are the stories about Hitler having gone there after the war, and of course it's an immense territory. It's hard for us to understand just how big this territory is. But I've read Hollow Earth theory, world ice theory, the various things that the Nazis spread, which are conspiracy theories that persist to this day. I don't find them in the least bit convincing.
Yeah, that's that. Like I say, I'm just going straight off topic, but it's just certain things that pop in. I think just because you're knowledgeable and you're very well read, so it's just a good how you see the world. What's the best advice you've ever received?
I'm not really sure. I'd probably be think for yourself. That go away and think about things on your own, talk to your friends, go and look things up on the internet, but be careful about what you're being sold. What's in it for the person who's giving you the idea? Is it because, I've seen it with born again Christians, and they have this tremendous enthusiasm, and then after a while the infatuation fades. And now, for it to be true, they've got to persuade you it's true. They've got to bring you in. And so be careful of what people are trying to sell you and look at the motivation they might have for selling it to you.
What do you think of religion?
I think it is. I think it's been a force for good and a force for evil. And that fundamentally the religion is tribal. It's so we're going to get into trouble, let's do it. I have studied the history of religion and I've been fascinated by it for a lifetime. If you look to the god Yahweh, commonly called Jehovah by Christians, you find that he exists in Babylonian times. The Old Testament, the oldest possible date for it is 900 BC for a part of Genesis. But we've got Babylonian ring seals, which tell the stories that are told in Genesis 1,000 years before that, 1,500 years before that. And we find that Yahweh, Jehovah, is one of 70 children of El and Asherah, the mother goddess. It's all in the records. We know about it. So when the first commandment says you'll have no other gods before me, isn't that an admission that there are other gods? So when we say there's only one God, well, why is the one God? Why doesn't it say I'm the only one? So what are we looking at, and how do we understand that? Religions are constructed and they evolve. They demonstrate evolution. So originally, 100,000 years ago, perhaps 10,000 years ago, people believed that they came out of the earth, that the earth was a womb or matrix. That's the old word for a womb.
That's a new word, isn't it?
Yeah. And they would return to it when they died. And that seems a relatively sensible belief. Then you started getting ideas of there being an abyss, which is a Sumerian word. That the earth is flat and underneath it is the abyss. And the abyss is where you go after you die, and you go there as a shadow, as a shade. And the original Jewish religion follows this belief that you're not going to be resurrected, you're not going to have a glorious life. There's no heaven in the origins of this religion. Then, around about 300 BC, Alexander the Great's people arrive in Judea and Israel and Samaria, and they teach the idea of resurrection because it's part of their religion. And that is then incorporated. So what I see is that religions evolve, they add ideas. There may well be a spiritual comfort in them or comfort in believing them. We all need a metaphor in which to live. It's never, I at 13, I couldn't bear the hypocrisy of the Christianity around me that I was being told in this school that we are meant to follow the rules of Jesus, and the main thing in life is to become as rich and powerful as possible. I just couldn't make sense of how they were fitting this together. So one day in a religious instruction class, I asked our Methodist teacher if only Methodists would go to heaven, and he paused and said yes. Now, we were an Anglican school. I didn't report him. I'm not a snitch. The next week, it just came into my head, could God ever forgive the devil? And he said no. And that was it for me. I stopped believing in their version of God and have never believed in a personified God ever since, that God is a person. Because again, something that allegedly created a universe of 100,000 million galaxies, each of them having that many stars in them on average, that's got to be something pretty big. That's not just the little God of the 7 planets, which is what we're still being taught. That's something way beyond my comprehension. And I've never felt, saints and angels, well, saints I can believe in, I suppose, angels and devils and all of these jinns, dibuks, gadons, there are words in all cultures. I don't believe in any of that.
I'm the same. I think we're living in a society where there's so much technology, there's so many cameras, but if you look at things like UFOs and ghosts, there's nothing, any clear-cut footage that would convince me. I would love to think there's an external force out there. I'd love to think there was a creator or whatever, but I've never seen anything concrete. I've seen some videos, but they used ones from like the 60s, 70s, flying saucers. You'll see like white sheets go across hallways. Look at the technology we have now. If anything, there should be more concrete evidence, like death or ghosts or aliens are among us. What do you think of stuff like aliens?
Well, I think it's
UFOs.
I think it's inevitable there are aliens in a universe of this size. I think the distances they'd have to travel, given that we are dealing with light years, so the time it takes light at 183,000 miles per second to a year of that travel, the distances are so immense that it seems unlikely to me that there would be communication. There's an interesting thing. When Russian records became available in 1991, after the war came down and all of that, it was found that behind the Iron Curtain, there were lots of reports of UFOs, but the descriptions of the craft and of the aliens in them were different from the ones in America and Western Europe. And I think that says something about the media, that says something about, the Greys or what have you, that there's a mythology. There are normal human states. So alien abductions, apart from the one involving Cartman, which was quite funny, alien abductions outside of South Park usually happen at twilight. They usually happen at a point where a person is just falling asleep or just waking up, hypnopompic or hypnagogic reveries, as they're called. There will be the sensation of not being able to move, which is called tonic immobility. That's why you don't punch people in your sleep, because you have tonic immobility. Your muscles freeze. So, and I have a friend who does. He's on an airplane and he punches the person next to him because he moves in his dreams. Most of us don't. So you wake up and you can't move. And you go, if you go back to the Middle Ages, you'll find accounts of succubi and incubi who sit on your chest and hold you down. These descriptions are so like alien abduction, but they're descriptions of the hypnotic reverie that you're in while you're still half dreaming. And physically, what happens, so I will always go for a natural rather than a supernatural explanation, having, spent enough time in a crazy thing like Scientology. I now go with the idea that Jesus put forward when Thomas said, "I don't believe it's you," and he said, "Put your fingers in the holes." And I want to be able to do that. I want to be able to actually see it and witness it and look for a natural explanation, look for something that shows how it can happen. And again, when you look at all of these wars, most of them are generated by people being given an imaginary idea of others. So reading it before World War I, there were more than 400 novels. Erskine Childers' Riddle of the Sands is the only one still in print, about there being German saboteurs in Britain. There weren't any. The term the Great War was used long before the war started. in Germany, they were teaching the idea that an apocalypse was coming that would cleanse the world and bring the benefits of German society, which was probably the best in the world at that time. They were determined to feed the poor, for example, under a practice that they called socialism. It's kind of changed its meaning since then. But they thought they would bring their enlightened civilization, and the only way to do that was a great war, Armageddon, to cleanse everything. People come to believe these delusions, and they're willing to give their lives up for them, for a nation. What is a nation? It's an imaginary community. When I have a friend in the US who a few years ago told me he was a patriot. He was also a Republican. I said, are you a patriot for Democrats as well? And he didn't want immigrants. And it's like, but your family, you're not Native Americans, right? So what do we mean by a nation, and why would we be willing to sacrifice our lives to support what is fundamentally, as we've agreed, a corrupt system that benefits a tiny amount of people?
Why do you think depression, suicide and addiction's on the rise, John?
I'm not sure that they are. It's very difficult to say because, of course, we don't have any numbers before the 1940s. So, and I was in Denmark years ago, and I said, how is it that Denmark has the highest suicide rate in the world? He said, because we were honest about it. He said, if you go to a Catholic, it was a theologian I was talking to, who was a pastor. If you go to a Catholic country, of course, suicide means you can't go to heaven. So doctors will fake death certificates so you can be buried in sanctified ground and go to heaven. So how accurate are our reporting systems? As you say, we don't actually know how many people there are in the world. And we are starting to classify, with the idea of neurodiversity or neurodivergence. I'm not keen on either word because I don't think there's anybody who's neurotypical. I'm certainly not, you're certainly not. We are variations. But that is now, we're now saying, well, there are 4 times as many people with high-functioning autism, and they weren't recognized before. And it's like, well, there's the problem. How many were being recognized? So take something like celiac disease, intolerance to gluten, that it's reckoned by experts that 1 person in 400 has this condition. But about 1 in 40 people now will not eat gluten because they believe they have this condition. The difference between who does and doesn't have and how it's diagnosed. I am very suspicious of the American Psychiatric Association's diagnostic and statistical manuals. Very. There was a great noise around the last one, which is around about 2012, because people are saying, well, you're listing symptoms and saying this person has this condition. So if you look, for example, at PTSD, that's the most controversial of all conditions because it has 633,000 possible combinations of symptoms. Major depression has 277. So what you're saying is it's one of those kind of chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia, which is to say we don't know what it is, but it has these symptoms. Depression, anxiety, what do those mean? We don't seem to find them in so-called primitive societies. People seem, when they're living in small communities, not to exhibit anxiety and depression. So we're told by the anthropologists. I don't know if that's true. In which case, anxiety and depression are possibly symptoms of an unhappy culture, of a culture that is in fact generating psychological and physical slavery, rather than freeing people, rather than feeding people, rather than looking after people. A society that is allowing genocide, that is permitting, as you say, what's happened in the Congo. It's just unbelievable there, or Sudan, Darfur, that these terrible massacres are taking place. And there's no real focus on it. You can't be aware of all of these things without becoming depressed. So we have to exclude some of it. We have to say, well, charity begins at home. I will do the best I can here. But there's enough that's happened in the world for everybody to be depressed. If you think about the Holocaust, and we're not, 6 million Jews, 200,000 Romani, blacks, homosexuals, schizophrenics. The Nazis killed everybody in every psychiatric institution they came to when they conquered another country because they wanted the beds for their soldiers. They sterilized 375,000 people, starting with the Action T4 program. They did these things. It's too horrible. If you spend your time thinking about this, how are you ever going to be a happy human being? Unless you believe, as I do, that we have all the tools to actually mend these problems. Whether we will or not, I don't know. I doubt it'll happen in my lifetime. But I am convinced from a lifetime of study that we can feed everyone, that we can stop fighting wars. And the way I look at it is we can't save the environment unless we stop fighting wars. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
And to stop fighting wars, we have to stop propaganda from being effective. We have to have people, interviews with Russian soldiers who've gone in and tortured Ukrainians and said, we want to undo the Nazism. We've been told that your leader is a Nazi. And you're going, well, he's a Jewish Nazi. That's the first thing that's a bit weird. But they've been sold a line about liberating these people. And of course, they're finding they don't want to be liberated. So they're having to make up more propaganda. Any reason to for aggression against other people is a bad reason. Every reason for defending yourself against aggression is a good reason. But we have a world where people want more. What is the aim for a politician? When you look at something like Jonestown, Jim Jones had built this huge following. 912 people died there, most of them murdered. It wasn't suicide, and it was Flavor Aid, not Kool-Aid as well, but details. But this guy, he knows he's coming to the end of his life, and he decides to take as many people with him as he can. It's a psychopathic craziness. And I think with some of our leaders that the fear of death is fundamental to human beings. And I think with some people, they either believe, as the Emperor Qin, who gives us the name China, believed, that by drinking mercury you can live forever. They believe themselves to be different. Or they want to create a huge effect upon the world. Like the guy who murdered Jeffrey Dahmer in prison, so that his name would be remembered. I've got no idea what his name was, so it didn't work. But people have this, rather than living a good and decent life and helping people, they can gain fame, they can gain celebrity and the adulation of other people. Look at Stalin or Mao. There's no justification for these two people. Hitler, I can see, may have believed he was trying to do good. Stalin and Mao, they just wanted to be emperors. They just wanted to control other people and exert their will on them. So we have this awful tendency to elevate psychopaths.
What do you think happens after death?
I don't think anything happens after death.
Lights out?
Yeah, a peaceful return.
To where?
To nothing, to not being. And the Buddhists, probably the most intellectually rigorous of religious sects, though I have disagreements certainly of their ideas. What they teach is there is no self, anatta. There isn't a self. The basic mistake we make is thinking that we are individuals. I don't think we're individuals. I think we're all the time interacting with other people and with the world. We're threads in a tapestry. It's a three-dimensional tapestry. I don't know how you'd make that, but we're threads in that tapestry. So as individuals, we will melt into that, and that's fine. It once you've passed that and accepted it, who cares? The eternal now, if there is eternity, is now. So I can, Montaigne, the brilliant French writer in the 16th century, wrote about death. And then he said, as a young man, I spent all of my time terrified of death. I just couldn't bear the thought of dying. He said, as an old man, and he died in his 50s, I realised that it's fine. I realise it's all right. There's a point where all of the worry, all of the pain, everything ends, and it's done. So it's about living a life fully in this moment, rather than craving going to heaven or being reincarnated. My mum, who lived to be 94, she was Anglican Christian, Sunday school teacher when she was young. She got into Scientology because she wanted to see if it was going to harm me. I didn't recruit her, I promise. She was in Scientology for 8 years. And by the time a few years before she died, she was 94 when she died, she said, when I'm gone, I'm done. I don't want to reincarnate. I don't want to go to heaven. I'm done. It's enough. And it's an attitude of mind where it's no longer terrifying. And of course, there is a distinction. Scientologists believe in past lives and reincarnation without understanding that the Hindus and the Buddhists call it the fear of the eternal return. They're trying to stop living. They're trying to stop coming back. That's the whole idea of Buddhism, to dissolve into nirvana, to no longer be the individual, but to be part of the bliss state or whatever. I'm not sure about the bliss state, but I'm happy. There are how many, 5 to 25 million species on this earth. I happen to be a member of the species that can enjoy itself, that can take pleasure, that can imagine, that can have flights of fancy. I don't think ants have that privilege,
Yeah. I think we'll finish up on that note. Jon, how you feeling today?
I feel good, and it's been a real pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, likewise. Listen, I could have spoke to you about so many different topics. I did take it off course there, but I know how educated you are and how well-read you are. It feels just good to get your perception of some things. How can people buy your books, Jon? How can people get in contact if they want to drop you a message, maybe stuck in Scientology, maybe want to ask something about religion? I don't know, but how can people get in contact? Where can they buy your books? Do you have a website, social media?
I do have a website. I have several, actually. The relevant one is jonatack.co.uk. Jon is spelt Jon because my name is actually Jonathan. I don't tell anybody that, though. I have Jon Atack Family and Friends YouTube channel. On there, there's a little button that says About, and if you press that, it'll give you an email address where you can contact my assistant, Spike. And I'll do the best I can. Obviously, I have a lot of requests, but I'll do the best I can to help people.
Jon, again, thank you for your time. I wish you all the best for the future, and I look forward to see what you do next.
Thank you,
God bless.
and it's been a privilege and a pleasure. Thank you.